I would just like to say everyone welcome to day 2. On behalf of myself, the Idea Center for Applied Ethics at the University of Leeds, and my co-organizer, Zach Goodmanson, I welcome you to the Philosophy and AI workshop. We're very grateful for the amount of interest that this event had, so we hope you get the most of it. Just to let everyone know, we're also live streaming on YouTube, and we have a link to the whole event on our website in case you want to access it later. For today, we will have 3 speakers. They will have 30 minutes to present, and then we will have 30 minutes for Q&A. My colleague Zach will be our moderator for this, so he'll let you know all the details. If you have any doubts, just message the chat, and we will be starting at 10.
Hi, Zach, if you're there, it's John. Let me know when you want me to share my screen and then I can do that, okay? I've got a bunch of slides and some videos, so I do need to be able to do that.
Yes, you can. I think you can share your screen now. We'll just wait until 10 exactly to start the presentation. But if you need time to set up now, then you can go ahead and do that.
Well, it's probably best. Oh, you've disabled participant screen sharing. So let me try again. Yeah, so it's just to make sure I get the right window showing. It would be good. Let me try again.
I think Gabby normally does the set by giving you the right permissions. So
yeah, the link I sent you should allow you to share your screen.
Well, when I click share screen, I get host disabled participant screen sharing.
I also get that. Gabby, can you click on the little arrow on share screen and you can just enable panelist screen sharing?
Yeah, I just did.
Thanks.
Good. So let me try again. That's one of the reasons for being a tad early now. So usually I get the wrong one. So, but let me try that one. So try that. Share that one. You need to do it in this order. Share that one. Right, now I need to go into presenter mode. Find the right button. So with any luck, you should.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
You're seeing the first slide, but without the next slide, but I can see the next slide.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Separate screen. Perfect. I actually got it right for once. Miracle.
Lucky.
Yeah, that's good. How many people did you have yesterday?
We had around 90 coming and going through the Zoom webinar, right. And over 100 looking at the YouTube live stream. So a lot of people probably tuning in today as well.
Oh, good. Well, that's pretty impressive.
To be honest, I mean, with the registrants, we had 400. So it's been a learning lesson that you can expect maybe, I don't know, 10, 20% of the people that actually register, where that's pretty much expected, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that probably is right.
Right, I think we should be all ready to go if you are, John.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Okay, so I get now to present our first speaker of the day, Professor John McDermid, Professor of Software Engineering and member of the High Integrity Systems Engineering Group and University Research Theme Champion for Risk, Evidence and Decision Making at the University of York. And he will be presenting us Embodied AI, Autonomous Systems and Ethics. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. As Gabrielle said, I'm going to talk about embodied AI, autonomous systems, and some ethical issues. I'd like to thank my colleagues Zoe Porter, Yan Jia, and Helen Monkhouse. Zoe's helped me with some of the philosophical angles, and I'll give a couple of examples which Yan and Helen have worked on. So I thought it might help if I started by explaining something about my background in engineering and what I see as the role of philosophy in that. Talk about autonomous systems, and then where I think some of them are actually safety critical, but also ethically critical. Come back to philosophical considerations, albeit from an engineering perspective. Then say something about collaboration. A long time ago, I studied general engineering. It was very broad, but actually quite shallow. I think the best thing about it is it made me happy to go and tackle any new subject, which is good because over my career, I've worked on electronics, software, built systems, including safety critical systems. And now my focus is on autonomous systems, which I say, I'll come back to this, but in many ways, I think are critical from an ethical perspective. Actually, it was also as an undergraduate, I first became interested in philosophy, and I had a friend who was studying philosophy, and I went to tell him I've been trying to read some book. I can't remember what, it might have been The Critique of Pure Reason. He said, "You're trying to read that by yourself without a philosopher telling you how to understand it?" And at that point, I realized an engineering interest and real philosophy are different. So any comments I make about philosophy, please understand it's from an engineer's perspective, not a philosopher's. These disparate things that I've worked on might seem to be rather separate, but actually they're pretty much parts of a whole. So some years ago, we were trying in the UK to buy some of these fine helicopters and made quite a mess of it in terms of problems around safety, in particular the software, which could mislead the pilots about what the aircraft was doing. And I helped the government sort out a strategy for solving these problems, which had some nice benefits, including meeting Her Majesty, who was kind enough to give me an OBE. So these strange, disparate things actually come together and have some value. But what about this philosophical perspective? Well, actually, I'll start with a very elementary discussion of some safety techniques. One of the things that we worry about in safety is how failures of components of systems can bring about an undesirable outcome. And one of the simplest techniques used is called a fault tree. So some top event, some undesirable outcome I want to avoid. Somewhere below it is an and it says this top event can occur if W and Z occur. Z itself can occur if X or Y occur, and this symbol is an OR. And then we identify what we call cut sets, which is the set of these events at the bottom that, if they occur together, will bring about the top event. And the minimum cut sets here, W and X or W and Y, are important because there's a smaller set of things that can go wrong that will cause this undesirable outcome. But actually, these are exactly Ioannis conditions. And so you're probably aware of Mackey's work on causation and conditionals. So it's exactly the same as Ioannis conditions. And there's other connections too. A lot of work that I was involved in has been around developing so-called safety cases, which is a structured argument supported by a body of evidence to demonstrate that the system is safe enough to use in a given application in a given operating environment. The safety cases are generally documents, they're rhetorical, not tools of dialectic. But one of the things that we've done in York is built a way of representing these arguments. I've shown a small fragment over here. Details don't matter, but there's a top level goal showing the system's acceptably safe to operate from a hazard control perspective. I then break this down into arguing over hazards and so on. Now, this graphical structure makes the argument quite clear, but actually when we developed this, we drew directly on Stephen Tillman's work on the uses of argument. This isn't exactly the structure that he proposed, but it was one of the fundamental motivations for what we did. So there's interplays here at numerous levels. So what's meant by an autonomous system? I'll try to illustrate that now briefly and scare you slightly if I can. So what robotics and autonomous systems do is do tasks cost effectively, more cost effectively than people doing them, to provide benefits to society. So it avoids things that are boring, repetitive, slow, maybe dangerous in factories and warehouses. So the picture at the top, courtesy of Avocado, is one of their warehouses. If you look carefully, you probably get an idea just how big this is. And these little gadgets on the top, these robots, go and pick groceries. So if you now order online, actually this thing will produce your order for you maybe in 10 minutes, whereas it might have taken 2.5 hours for people to go around and collect it manually. We can support people in independent living. This is a picture of a Japanese system. Actually going to sea as a seafarer is still dangerous, so we can take people off ships if we can make the vessels autonomous, and people are working on that. Perhaps the most familiar is work on so-called autonomous driving, but that's trying to eliminate human error in accidents, and typically people quote 93–94% of accidents have a human cause. So what's then meant by autonomy? One of my favorite books is the Oxford English Dictionary, and this says that autonomy is the ability of a person to make his or her own decisions, and it uses other terms like independence, self-government, and so on. So to me, what's really crucial about robotics and autonomous systems is we transfer the decision-making responsibility to the humans. Actually, this ought to be very familiar to us. If any of you have an electric kettle that switches itself off when the water's boiling, that's actually autonomous. You don't have to go and switch it off yourself. If you have a car with an adaptive gearbox, it learns from your behavior and changes the way it behaves accordingly. So vacuum cleaners, things like this little gadget at the bottom, will actually learn to find its way around a room. And if you move the furniture, it will relearn. These things use artificial intelligence, which I don't particularly like as a phrase, or machine learning as the brain for the system. This is what actually enables it to do its work. So those are quite broad terms. When is it really autonomous or really just automated? Well, I think there's some simple tests. So it isn't autonomous if the users initiate every action or mediate every action. The system says do X and the human thinks about it. If the environment changes, then I need as an engineer to explicitly redesign my system. And if the capabilities are static in operation. But it's at the other end of the spectrum. If the user sets the mission and the system does the rest, I get into my aircraft as a pilot and I say, New York, sit back and drink a cup of tea, and the system does the rest, then that would be autonomous. If the environment changes and the systems change, the plane's flying to New York, the weather changes, it says, no, I don't like the look of that thunderstorm, I'll go and fly around it, then it's adapting to changes in the environment. And it improves in operation. Over a number of flights, it finds more optimal routes where it burns less fuel. In reality, it's a spectrum from things that are human-driven to fully autonomous, and above are indicators. Now, let me illustrate what an autonomous system might do. And I don't know if the sound will come through on this. So as it says, don't try this at home.
Don't move. Yeah, move it.
If you haven't noticed, that actually is a knife on the end of the robot arm. Looks quite sharp to me.
It's pretty freaky.
I believe the gentleman whose hand it is actually programmed this thing. But
stop that happening in the best way through.
I think it would. I think there would be a certain amount of blood, or severed bits.
Right, so that's something that's autonomous. Once you set it going, it got on with it by itself. Very foolish. Hang on.
Right.
So I need the next slide. This is something that says do try at home. There is some sound on this, but again, you've actually got subtitles here. So the idea of this robot called Chiron is to help people be able to stay longer at home, to be independent. When people are older and infirm, often one of the problems is being able to stand and get out of bed. And the idea of this gadget that's ceiling mounted is it would enable people to be able to get up and move about their own home and to stay independent for longer. I mean, interestingly, from a safety perspective, there are all sorts of challenges here. As you'll see, it lifts her up in a moment, and it would be very easy if somebody was frail, if it didn't work right, to have them fall over and land on the floor and be in a worse situation. But also there's an actually interesting ethical perspective of this as well. You know, keeping them independent for longer is a good thing. But actually, if it means they end up being isolated, it actually has some downsides as well. So all of these things need to be looked at in a balanced way. So here now it's going to see it help her to stand. This is actually the principal investigator on this research project, so she's not putting anybody else at risk. And so the idea is now that having got to a standing position, to be able to walk independently. And there are many, many more examples I could show you, but that gives some idea of not a very sensible robot and one that has some real social purpose. As I said, these things had to make use of machine learning. So why is it the tool of choice for these sorts of systems? Well, fundamentally, we train them on some data, then they're able to generalize beyond that training data to deal with other situations. So if you think of that robot we've just seen, if I went and sat on the bed, it would work for me. I'm a different height, different weight, and so on. But it would actually manage to balance the forces so that work. More significantly, in some applications, for example, autonomous driving, it works very well with unstructured data, works on open context systems where we can't describe ab initio all the things that will be encountered. But these things are actually have some limitations. They're inherently uncertain. And I'll say a little bit more about this later on, but things in autonomous driving, make an assessment of things they see in an image and say, well, it's 80% certain it's a vehicle. But they sometimes get it wrong. They have false positives. They say it's a vehicle when it isn't, and false negatives. From a safety perspective, one of the big challenges is that the models that are learned are not inspectable by humans. They're actually just a big bunch of data sitting in a computer, but they're in a form that is really inscrutable. And actually the community hasn't agreed how we assure safety, or we verify and validate them. And actually that's exactly what the Assuring Autonomy program I'm working on is actually trying to address. So let me then say just a little bit more about the sorts of systems that we produce, and make a distinction between those things that are simply online and those which are embodied. So an online system, I'm making recommendations to a user, and sometimes the term predictions is used. Then the human ultimately makes a choice, a decision. Amazon recommends some purchases for me, and I agree or normally don't. But where what's being recommended is more important, for example, medical decisions, can the human cross-check that? Do they have another source of truth? But also there's often risk of so-called automation bias. The system recommends something. The easy thing to do is to say yes. Now, I'm not going to talk about this in any detail technically, but one of the things that can also help is presenting explanations of the reasons why that recommendation was made. And these also include counterfactuals. What would need to change to get a different result? And actually, isn't this just sort of possible world models? So again, the sort of things that philosophers think about it, that counterfactuals are proposing a different world, another possible world. If that was the case, then you'd have got a different answer. Let me give you one example of an online system, then I'll talk more about embodied systems. The diagram here is from my colleague Yan Jia, who's been working on the use of machine learning in medical applications. And the diagram here is a sort of clinical pathway, but modified to incorporate a machine learning component. Don't need to see the details, but the sort of chunk top left is lab and other tests which are analyzed and provide data. The red dotted box is the steps that a clinician will go through to make a diagnosis and a recommendation. And the green is the machine learning bit. It actually uses a technology called reinforcement learning. What this system is doing is looking at various patient vital signs, considering the treatment of sepsis, and the decisions here about delivering intravenous fluids and vasopressors. So in this case, the doctor's own ideas and the recommendations of the machine learning come to a final decision made by a clinician. Now, in this case, they do have their own judgment to use to cross-check. So there are issues about this, but the human is able to exercise judgment. And although treatment of sepsis is time critical, they're talking about hours, not seconds or milliseconds. So there's time for them to make choices. But what happens with embodied systems? Here, the machine learning is in control in a rather more direct sense, perhaps involved in decisions on a millisecond basis. And it's mainly used for two things: perception or understanding. It's building models of the world from a range of sensors, including cameras. Often uses things called deep neural networks. It then makes some plans. It decides what to do next. I want to fly from here to New York. I've seen this weather. Okay, I'm going to replan my route to avoid these thunderstorms. Sometimes this is just conventional software, but we use techniques such as reinforcement learning that has been used in this medical example for doing that. So there's some safety questions here. Can false negatives make it unsafe? And I'm actually going to show you a little video later on of a Tesla that might make you think the answer to that is yes. But because these technologies are pretty opaque to human inspection, can we show that they're safe prior to deployment? Actually, how can we monitor them in operation? Now, let me try to illustrate what I mean here. So this example image is from a sort of camera that's used for assessing scenes for doing perception. If it shows up well, it's actually on a Mercedes. What the algorithms do is identify objects in the picture and place bounding boxes around them. So it says, there's an object in there, there's another object here. It hopefully will decide that these things are cars, and it will notice over here there are some pedestrians. Actually, you can see already one of the problems is I want to distinguish individuals, not just a group together. But some of you may have noticed that in the background, actually, there's a tram. Not so easy to see because it's occluded, but actually deciding what these objects are is really quite important. Because this is a tram, it's actually running on rails. So if I want to predict its trajectory so I don't drive into it, then knowing it's a tram means I can know it goes up here because my map tells me that's where the tram lines go. But if it didn't do that, it kind of looks like it's a very big thing coming up the road towards me. So its classification really matters. So that's perception of machine learning in one slide. It's a tad more complicated, but I hope it gets you the idea. Then path planning is often concerned about risk. It's an example from a company called 5AI, who are working on technology for autonomous driving. This is actually showing driving around a car park. The green bounding boxes around cars. The blue is the vehicle itself. And these different shaded, different colored lines are possible paths. And so the way this thing works is it works out some possible paths for its task, getting round so it can exit the car park, and it classifies them according to risk. You know, there's a bunch of red ones here. They're red because it's quite a narrow gap to squeeze through, and so there's more of a risk of collision. But it works out alternatives and chooses paths. Now, I said I'd show you a little thing from a Tesla. So I'm going to show you next video of a Tesla going down a highway on its so-called autopilot. So it's following the lane that it's in, and this video is taken from a dash cam of a car following it. So let's have a look at this. So here's the car heading happily down the road, and oh whoops, that wasn't very much fun. And I don't know if you saw a little bit of yellow. First of all, there was a plastic barrier, and now you can see there's a concrete barrier on the left. So that lane was closed, but the systems on the Tesla didn't see that. So in some sense, that was a false negative. It didn't think there was something there, i.e. a barrier, when actually there was. And he certainly reconfigured his car in a kind of expensive way. I can illustrate a little bit further how much that sort of thing matters, but also why it's a rather more complex task. So you may recall there was a fatality, an Uber test vehicle in Tempe, Arizona, killed a lady pushing a bicycle. The picture on the left gives a little bit of a timeline about what happened. So this comes from the accident report. So there are pedestrian positions marked here as she's walking across the highway and was hit here. The car at various points in time, matching with the times where we've shown where she is, detected her and made some decisions. And so actually what happened is, although it detected her on several occasions, the car changed the classification. At some point it thought it was a pedestrian, some points a car, and it uses the classifications to decide on trajectory. So when up here, it's on a left turn lane. So the assumption that the Uber made is that it's on a left turn lane, so it's going to exit the motorway, so won't be in front. And it was only 1.2 seconds before the impact that it decided that there was something in the way and needed to stop. And actually, the way the system was designed, so it dealt with false positives in a way that didn't cause the car to stop unnecessarily. It told the driver there's something in the way rather than actually stopping the car. Unfortunately, the operator wasn't really monitoring what was going on, didn't notice the lady with the bicycle anyway, and actually was very late to respond to the warning. But there are bigger problems here. I mean, the engineering processes in Uber weren't ideal, because actually the car threw away all the history of the motion of the pedestrian every time it changed the classification. It doesn't do that now. They decided that was a bad choice, but they didn't actually oversee the operators to see how well they were doing their job. And also in Arizona, actually the regulations around this sort of driving were quite lax, or you could put it a different way. Actually, they're trying to encourage this sort of experimentation in their state because they thought it was good for the economy. So there's a number of issues which have ethical perspectives, way beyond just the safety issues. So I'm going to show you one slightly scary diagram, but don't worry about it. So if you look at the bottom, this big bottom rectangle, it says sense, understand, decide, act. So this is how the autonomous systems work. They sense the world, they build an understanding of it. I've shown you an example of perception. they make a decision about what to do, for example, choosing a trajectory, act, they turn the steering, they turn up the engine, they apply the brakes. That affects the real world, they go around again. The way the systems here are developed is by 3 stages. I gather data about the problem I'm trying to solve. I build models using machine learning to solve it. I do some verification of the model to try to convince myself and maybe others it's good enough before I deploy it. There's a number of questions that arise, some of them technical, but some of them have ethical perspectives. We're all aware, I think, of systems that have actually been biased. So one of the questions is the data I'm using biased? Does it represent the real operational situations? When the system operates in the real world, can I update it from the ground truth of real operations? And when I look at the model learning part, actually different model learning, different ML techniques have different capabilities. Am I using an appropriate approach, appropriate model? The way the thing learns, even if the data is not biased, the learning might reintroduce bias. So does the model represent ethical behaviors? Can I actually understand or explain the learned behaviors? And similar things in terms of verification, and from a safety perspective, we want to know whether or not it's actually mature enough to deploy. And in terms of many systems, can the users mediate the system's outputs? And even if in theory they are meant to be able to do that, actually are they able to determine ground truth independently of the system so they can really exercise judgment? So there's a bunch of technical but also ethically informed questions there as well. So let me come to philosophy. Again, philosophy as an engineer, so apologies for any infelicities here. So one of the things that we have to face with these sorts of systems is the so-called problem of many hands, which I understand was formulated in 1980 by a guy called Dennis Thompson, in the context of political and public policy, noting that many individuals are involved in these policy decisions and their implementation. And it's therefore hard to see who's responsible for some of those decisions. That's relevant in a wide range of subjects, engineering generally, but certainly design, development and operation, autonomous systems. So many different individuals contribute here. If I go back to Uber at Temper, the lady sitting behind the steering wheel, the safety monitor, was clearly involved, but so were the designers at Uber. It was actually originally a Volvo vehicle, but they probably didn't contribute much because many of their safety systems were disabled by Uber to make them work. But the legislature in Arizona that wanted to encourage this sort of driving was also involved as well. It's really quite difficult in principle to identify who's responsible for that behavior. So there may be some things we can do about it. This idea of proxy agents, which again I believe goes back to the work of Thomas Hobbes, where a proxy agent is taking actions in place of another agent. So can an autonomous system be a proxy agent? Well, when I first heard about this, I was initially pretty skeptical. Computers and software aren't people, but actually the concept's very broad. It includes regulators and lawyers. And I wouldn't say that lawyers aren't people, but they do think in different ways. So maybe people who think in different ways can stand in place of others. And maybe we could extend that to autonomy. And if we did, then can it help us understand these autonomy issues? Can we use it descriptively to talk about how we transfer decision-making responsibility from people to machine? Can we use it in an explanatory sense? And so, make, proxies of the users and the designers and others? Can we also use it to help us understand legal liability and moral responsibility? I don't propose to answer those questions, although I'll be happy to debate them. But let me also show you this translates into engineering. And the diagram here is some work done in conjunction with Helen Monkhouse I mentioned at the beginning. So these so-called autonomous vehicles aren't fully autonomous. There's actually shared control between the driver and the system. And I do this little table that the rows are classes of tasks. There's basic control tasks, operational driving tasks, and so on. And so then individual rows. So this first one here is pull away from standstill. The agent is shown in green, so the autonomous car does that. Monitoring is actually shared by the human and by the vehicle. It monitors its own behavior, but the driver will look to make sure it doesn't accelerate too fast and hit a car in front or whatever. But actually, the way these systems are designed and implemented right now, safety remains the responsibility of the human, and that's shaded in gray. So this is exactly a descriptive use, so actually perhaps building on those proxy models. But interestingly, there's also a legal perspective on that. Sorry, this is a very long quote, but I just hope it's useful to see what's come from the National Highways Transport Safety Authority, usually pronounced NHTSA, in the US. And this related to a request from Google. And it says, with this design, no human occupant could meet the current federal definition of a driver. So they said we should interpret the driver as referring to the self-driving system, and it's more reasonable to identify the driver as whatever, as opposed to whoever. I think it should be whomever is doing the driving. So this notion of a proxy has actually been recognized in the law in the US, and it might be over time we see a shift to thinking about proxies in this sort of way. Well, what about decision making? Again, we have many hands, but work by John Rawls and others, including Norman Daniels, I think would be very well known here. What we're talking about is, can we adopt these ideas from reflective equilibrium into engineering decision making? There's a number of possible roles here. I illustrate two. One of the really difficult questions is understanding how safe is safe enough. There are some technical issues here, but it's actually more of an ethical question. If you think about this robot for lifting somebody up, I say there's even a simple ethical question there. It allows more independence, which is good, but does it cause people to be isolated for longer, which is bad? It's a decision here, a choice, not a discovery, which actually having reflective equilibrium might help with. And again, a sort of practical example of this, recently, the UK has recently consulted on introducing autonomous lane keeping systems, and they did a wide industry consultation on that. So in effect, you can see these things happening in practice anyway. But also, I think it's a way of engaging different stakeholders to find a balance between what's technically feasible or optimal technically and what's ethical. Actually, these machine learning projects tend to move very fast. It's not uncommon for the machine learning models to be updated on a daily basis, updated every 24 hours. There's merits in exploring things we can do in slower time, for example, deployment decision making. In one of the models we have of how you manage autonomous systems, the Ensuring Autonomy International Program, we have this little diagram that talks about a decision to deploy. It's informed by safety case. I mentioned earlier the argument about why it's sufficiently safe, but actually this needs to be addressed by a bunch of different stakeholders, and we might try to do some form of reflective equilibrium around the deployment decision, which can be done in slower time, involving regulators and standards bodies and the public, probably proxies for the public, operators, and so on. This might also shed some light on legal accountability. So I just want to come back to this issue of collaboration. Many of you read, things like books like Block Box Thinking and some of the others by Matthew Syed, and he's very strong about the importance of diverse thinking, which is what I really want to come back to. So although we've long thought about safety critical systems, now we perhaps should think of them more as being ethically critical, and we do need to make progress on technical issues, but these technical solutions are insufficient. Maybe they're Ioannis, but they're certainly insufficient. But to make progress on some key things, such as how safe is safe enough, we need this diverse thinking, we need an ethical perspective. And fundamentally, the reason for that is these autonomous systems shift distributions of risk. They can shift responsibility and accountability. We need to understand how to manage those shifts and ensure that they're done in a way that's actually acceptable to society. I think to do that well, we need to collaborate across disciplines, and I'm very open to ideas for discussing this, for knowledge exchange and collaboration across disciplines. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. I'll finish that, and it's probably good now to stop the sharing.
Thank you very much, Professor McDermid. For the question and answer session, we'll probably just take a 4-minute break or so until 22. And for those of you who were here yesterday, then you already know how we've been doing the question and answers, which is there's a little Q&A button on the bottom, and you can open a question and just put in kind of a fairly simple summary of what your question is, and then other people can vote on them by clicking the thumbs up button. And the ones which get voted the most go right up to the top, and we can answer those questions first. Unlike yes, sorry?
Try to answer them.
Try to answer them. Yesterday we didn't do fingers. For those who don't know, a finger is like just a small point on a question and answer. I think this time we can. If you want to raise your finger, then just put your hand up or just type finger or point into the chat and we can call on you then. So put your questions in and get voting, and we'll start answering in 3 minutes.
It looks like you're not going to get many questions. I've stunned or confused them.
Maybe it was just so comprehensive. There's nothing to add.
I doubt that. Oh, we've got one. Do you want me to answer that verbally, or we can
Oh, well, what I can do, if people aren't anonymous, then I can enable them to ask their question themselves.
Okay.
But with the anonymous one, I'll read it out so we can have it for the recording. It is, should all engineers working on autonomous vehicles be forced to take a crash course, pun intended, in ethics?
If I'm allowed to respond to that, I think my simple answer is all no, but I think it should be for those that are in, critical decision-making responsibilities. I mean, somebody I was talking to yesterday, who's the CTO of a company working on autonomous driving, I mean, certainly does take the ethical perspective really seriously, and I think it's right that he has that perspective, and I know he does, but I don't think everybody working on that needs to, but it should be for, I think, key roles. It should be something that should be encouraged, if not legislated.
Okay, thank you. Mick, I've enabled your microphone if you want to ask your question. I think I should have. Oh no, I think I clicked the wrong button. Sorry.
Well, you could always read his question, and I'll try to answer it.
No, I think instead of enable him to talk, I accidentally invited him to be a panelist, which means that he's left and then has to rejoin. So, whoops. But Mick should be coming back, and for now, Dennis, I'll enable your microphone and allow you to ask your question.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So thank you very much for the interesting presentation. It was really nice. And actually my former professor of science and technology studies was an engineer as well. So definitely feel there's a lot of value in connecting the two topics. And I was wondering, when looking at the differences in the decision-making process as an automated system makes these different decisions, I was wondering, where do you feel you would make the cutoff point on where the decision should be human or machine, and how would you classify in, what makes you describe that distinction between the two?
Right. I mean, I think there are a number of issues here, and I'll try to just illustrate a couple of them. One of them is time. If you're talking about this sort of online decision making or recommendation system, you actually generally have time to make a decision. If it's something like driving a car or whatever, it's much harder to have sufficient time to be able to make a decision. So, for me, one of the things that happens there is if there's not enough time for a user, an operator, to sensibly judge the situation and make a decision as the system is operating, then that has to be with the machine. But that then transfers the responsibility back onto the design and assessment process, and we have to be much more confident in how that technology works, how the automation works, to be able to agree that that's safe enough to deploy. So if you think about my little picture of the deployment decision, if the operators can't be actively involved in mediating decisions, then you need much more confidence in the system before you allow it to be deployed. And the other things really are about risk, what the level of risk is, but also who's put at harm. If I'm only putting myself at harm, like this guy with his robot and his knife, or I'm putting a much wider segment of the public at harm, then I think there's a difference in how we should let the individuals make decisions there. So it's actually quite a complicated space, but I hope I've given you some dimensions on that.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I was mainly sparked because of your example in the medical field, because it's very often when, for instance, looking at image recognition and, for instance, MRI scans, or as your example with sepsis, that in the end there's still that human decision factor that says, this is the treatment I'm going to do. So it's very interesting indeed to know. So thank you very much.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Thank you. So we've got Mick. Mick, sorry, I've accidentally invited you to be a panelist. So your video is enabled, but you can ask a question now if you're ready to. Your microphone's muted, so you...
Yeah, sorry, somehow I got kicked out of Zoom as well. It's a sort of a statement as much as a question. John, I thought your presentation was excellent. Thank you.
Right.
But it seems to me that autonomous cars, autonomous driving is the acid test for AI and ethics, because there's other issues at stake as well as risks, things like human autonomy, freedom, privacy, etc., etc. And, lots of people like to drive for fun. First, I thought people like to use motorcycles, even though they're dangerous.
Yes.
Sadly, most of the population of the world speeds at some time. And I wondered if you have any thoughts on those kinds of issues when you're talking about human autonomy and freedom.
Yeah, sure. I do think it is very much, a trade-off between these different factors, as well as the engineering difficulties of making it work. And if you said we were going to enter a situation where nobody was allowed to drive anymore, you had to use an autonomous mode of transport. I, for one, wouldn't be very comfortable of that, because I think it would remove from people, something from which they actually gain pleasure. I mean, I enjoy driving. I have a car which has some, autonomous driving support, but I still drive it. And I personally like that balance. And I was offered something fully autonomous, even if I was, completely confident it was safe, I probably wouldn't choose to take it. And so I think we need to have that flexibility. But you're right. I mean, there are lots of other complex questions here. Let's say these vehicles were entirely autonomous, and they passed all our safety tests. Would you put your teenage children, would you put your 5-year-old in the vehicle by him or herself to be taken to school or to kindergarten? And so I think it raises, and the answer might be, well, it depends. Do I have two-way video communication with them all the time? In which case, I might be content to do that. But there can still be situations, there's an accident, no fault of the autonomous vehicle, it can't avoid the impact because somebody's broken the law and come across in front of them. You've then got the child unaccompanied in the vehicle. How do you ensure that they're looked after safely? So it's a very complex space, and I think merely being able to show you can make these things work and they're safe under normal conditions is far from enough. So I think it's a very rich area. I think many of the debates are too narrow and or get distracted by things like the trolley problem, which I think is actually a non-issue. So I think it's a very rich area. I think it would be a very interesting area for more public debate to get a richer and rounder understanding of the issues.
Thank you, John. That's very well said. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question from Emma.
Hi, John. I really enjoyed your talk. I've been wondering for a while and trying to write up something on the role of ethics, the place in the process of scientific thinking of ethics, given where we are at the moment. So given the interpretation of autonomous in engineering terms, as you've explained it, does it not make sense to advocate viewing ethical considerations as a factor of scientific research that should be fundamentally enabling rather than an after-the-fact add-on to innovation of this kind? So do we have maybe to change our minds on how we see the role of ethics in scientific work and when it is that we think about ethical concerns? Maybe autonomous cars is a good example because to some extent it is already built into the innovation in some way, even if not always explicitly, but it's there. But should we maybe broaden that to other examples, or what would be your view on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to your question is yes, it should be built in, and I could stop there. Let me just slightly amplify on that. Safety engineers are often criticized of looking at something and saying, nah, that's not safe, go away, don't do it. Good safety engineering is done concurrently with design and influences design to make it better, to be still effective, but actually to be safe. I think the same needs to be done from an ethical perspective. I don't know how you do that in general, but I do think that that's the right thing that we ought to be working towards. Hence my comment about collaboration at the end. I think that's really important. You can't do it on every minutiae, every line of code that gets written, but it has to be done at the sort of right sort of level. And again, maybe we could use things like the reflective equilibrium around critical design choices to enable that to be done effectively. So yeah, I'm fundamentally in agreement with you there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question from Anna Strasser. I'll just enable your microphone. Sorry, 1 second. There we go.
Hi, thanks for the interesting talk. I'm always wondering why people always talk about autonomous driving. I wonder how you would evaluate autopilots already in action in aeroplanes.
Right. Well, in many senses, autopilots are a lot simpler than autonomous driving, and the answer is because the environment they work in is much simpler. You know, it's an oversimplification to say there's just air and nothing else. It's not quite true, of course. You have to worry about avoiding other airplanes. But air traffic management is designed to keep the aircraft far enough separated that just, you know, flying the aircraft on a predefined route is a relatively straightforward task. The autopilots can do takeoff and landing, although generally they're not all connected together to do a fully autonomous flight. So to me, it's a much less complicated problem because the environment in which they're operating and making decisions on routing and so on is much simpler, much cleaner. The most unpredictable thing, I think, is weather. And as far as I know, by and large, pilots still monitor the weather and take back control from the autopilot and change the route if appropriate. So I think there's a huge difference. Not saying the autopilots aren't, you know, effective pieces of technology, but I think there's just a huge difference in the technical problem that they're having to address.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Next question is by somebody who's anonymous again, so I'll read it out if that's all right. You say you would not have a fully autonomous car. If autonomous vehicles reduce accident fatalities by 90%, for instance, how could you or anyone ethically justify not using said vehicle all the time?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the problem here is about the statistics. We know about the accidents that happened, which are, you know, predominantly human caused. What we don't know is about the ones that didn't happen. And I can't tell you how many times I've taken avoiding action, change my course, brake prematurely or whatever to avoid conflicts. We would have to be extremely clear that these systems behaved in such a way they prevented things that humans already prevented. Much harder to make a case for that than it is for you know, reducing accident rates. And I think one of the other reasons as well is we should also look at this from a slightly broader perspective about you know, risk distribution. You know, if for the sake of argument I did this for cars, but actually they were rubbish at dealing with motorbikes and bicycles, so I differentially put at risk people taking on vehicles on two wheels, we might still decide that was actually not acceptable thing to do. So in a way, the statistics look very simple and compelling, but actually they're not if you unpeel the question behind that. Okay.
Thank you. I see that Dennis has got another question. I wonder if I could insert my own question there quickly.
Oh, I'm sure you can.
I don't know very much about the engineering side of things, but I do think about autonomy a fair bit. And one of the things I was wondering about was that you said an autonomous agent is something which performs a mission after the goals have been set.
Yes.
And it seemed to me like that's quite different from humans who seem to set their own goals. And yeah. If we put that on the kind of the same level of autonomy, then wouldn't that mean that humans are always going to be more autonomous than these kind of autonomous robots or autonomous artificial agents?
Sure. I think that's right. But I mean, humans are building these things. We're building them to help us. Therefore, you know, we should be able to determine for what purpose they are being use. So I think that's always the case. And maybe some people think we should build some autonomous things that will decide for themselves what they want to do. I personally would not be very comfortable with being engaged in anything like that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dennis, I'll turn on your microphone so you can ask your question now.
Thank you. Yeah, no, sorry for being there again. I just was really interested in your concept of your notion of risk, and it put me to think about the precautionary principle. And for instance, how Charles Perrow describes the normal accident theory and high-risk technologies. And I thought, how do you feel the precautionary principle should play a role in the development of autonomous systems?
I mean, that's a very interesting question, and it's actually quite complicated. I think to get a good balance on this. So let me take it to an extreme to try to shed some light on it. So you could if you took precautionary principle to extreme, you say, well, I'm never going to do anything new because it might be dangerous. I'm going to be very, very cautious about it. But actually, these sorts of autonomous systems bring benefits with them as well. So I think that the difficulty is actually finding a sensible balance between innovation and responsible risk taking. And I think that the precautionary principle is not as extreme as I painted it, but I think the precautionary principle takes you too far away from allowing responsible innovation. So that's not a very sharp answer to your question, but for me, I feel we're in this problem of actually trying to have a sensible balance, and the precautionary principle would push us too far towards risk aversion, if you like.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. And indeed,
if you know a better answer, I'd be very interested to hear it.
No. Well, I mean, I try to. Maybe something to pick up at a later stage, because I try to work with companies on it, but it's very interesting.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So that's our last question. We've still got a few minutes left if anyone wants to raise a hand to make a point. Just see if anyone does. Okay, I suppose not. It's a good as time to finish. We're about at the end of things. So we'll be coming back at 10 past for our next talk. The only thing to say is thank you very much, Professor McDermid, for the talk. It was very good. Thank you. And another Q&A did come in.
Oh yeah, I just answered it in the chat. It was just this is actually about being able to distribute responsibility among the actors if something goes wrong, and the answer is no. At least I don't think you can actually always do it fairly, and I think that is actually a real problem that we need to resolve.
Okay, thank you. So we'll give a break then and come back at 10 past. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Hi everyone, we're getting ready to receive our next speaker today, Dr. Ioannis Votsis. He's a senior lecturer of the Department of Philosophy at the New School of the Humanities and member of the advisory board of the Centre for Philosophy of Natural and Social Science at the London School of Economics. And today he will be presenting us machine-made Jabberwocky. So let's welcome Ioannis. Ioannis, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Okay, so let me share my slides with you guys. Okay, let's see. Okay, can you guys see the slides?
Yeah, it's all perfect.
Yeah, good. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you, Gabriela and Zach, for organizing this event. So today I'm going to talk about creativity and AI. That's a topic that I've been thinking about for a long, long time, ever since I was a child, in fact. And I used to have conversations with grown-ups about this issue. But I never, even though it was preoccupying my mind all this time, I never actually spent any time writing anything on it. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to write on this topic. So I prepared this talk. Okay, so let me start by giving you a little bit of an introduction. So AI research is concerned with both narrow and wide goals, right? So in fact, there's a distinction which goes back to one of my old teachers, John Searle, from this famous paper in 1980 in BBS, where he distinguishes between weak and strong AI. Now, the kind of distinction that I present here is not exactly the one envisioned by John, but it is nonetheless one that people often talk about, which is weak AI is something like systems that perform well in some cognitive areas. And by cognitive here, I mean really super broadly understood. And that could involve activities like playing games, solving equations, or offering diagnoses, whereas strong AI is something like a system that performs well in all cognitive areas, right? So which basically has the ability of all-round abilities of humans. Now, to the extent that AI research actually seeks to mimic or at least to reproduce human abilities, the question, of course, naturally arises whether AI can match our creative abilities. Now, there are, as usual with these kinds of cases, you have some naysayers. So here I have some famous naysayers going back to Lady Ada Lovelace in this famous Note G, where she says the analytical engine, so Charles Babbage's engine that she wrote notes on, has no pretension whatever to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform, right? Now, I don't want to be too harsh on Lovelace, because she obviously was talking about the analytical engine. There weren't many other machines around at the time. So I don't want to just extrapolate too much from this. So let me just move on to some other quotations. Here's another old teacher of mine, Hubert Dreyfus, who is famous for taking a very negative approach towards AI, intelligence, and creativity. And in 1972, in this famous book, What Computers Can't Do, he says, real creativity is too much to ask, it's impossible to imagine how a computer program could creatively solve a problem or know that it had done so. And more recently, Selmer Bringsjord, cognitive scientist, and some of his colleagues say, unfortunately, it seems to us, or at least to one of us, so Selmer, that the moral of the story may be irredeemably negative. There may simply not be a way for a mere information processing artifact to pass LT. LT is their version of the Turing test, which they call the Lovelace test. because what Lovelace is looking for, so what the test is looking for, may require a kind of autonomy that is beyond the bounds of ordinary causation in mathematics. Right? So we're going to come back to this issue of autonomy later. So we looked at the naysayers. Let's look at one quotation from a yaysayer. So this is Herbert Simon and Alan Newell in this paper on heuristic problem solving from 1958, where they say, there are now in the world machines that think, that learn, and that create. That's shocking already. Right? This is 1958, and they're saying there are now machines that think, that learn, that create. Right? Moreover, their ability to do these things is going to increase rapidly until, in a visible future, the range of problems that they can handle will be coextensive with the range to which the human mind has been applied. Okay, very nice quotation, clearly stating that machines can be creative and they can be as creative as humans. Now, it's worth noting here that I did read quite a bit of material and I was trying to find more quotations from the clear quotations from yaysayers, and I couldn't so easily find them, even though I'm assuming that some of these people who advocate that machines will reach super intelligence at some point may also want to talk about creativity, the creativity of machines, equaling and perhaps even surpassing the creativity of humans in at least some areas, probably maybe also in all of them. I'd be interested to find out some more quotations if you guys have them. Okay, so what's the aim and the plan here? Well, the aim is I'm going to look at some of the reasons that the naysayers offer, and I'm going to subject those reasons to a careful examination, and I will find them wanting. And the plan is I have 3 sections to the talk. Basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is creativity. So I'm going to look at some theories of creativity. Then I'm going to talk about these arguments against creativity in AI. And then I'm going to offer some counters. So let me not waste any time and begin with some theories of creativity. Okay. So as you can imagine, unsurprisingly, there is no theory of creativity that's universally accepted out there, probably not even majority-wise accepted. Right? This is true in both philosophy and both within and without philosophy. Right? So there are theories, in particular in psychology, but even these are not fully accepted. So they're not accepted rather universally or even by the majority. So I can give you just a few, like a sample of such theories. For example, there's a sociocultural theory that says that creativity is a social activity. And it's not only social, but it's also conditioned by the surrounding history. And the output even, so whether or not an output is considered to be creative depends, again, on social networks, in particular on the judgments of experts. Here's a Darwinian approach. The Darwinian approach is simply to say, just like in Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, you have some kind of mutation process, and then you have some natural selection pressures that filter out the fit from the unfit. Then you have also in creativity a 2-stage process with a blind stage that produces or yields, generates ideas, and then a selection stage that filters out the bad ones. And here's another one. Creativity is problem solving, right? So it's providing novel solutions to problems or providing solutions to novel problems, right? So that's another idea out there. Now, you know, there's lots going for each of these, I would say. But there is no theory that is widely accepted. Even so, I don't mean to be completely negative about this literature, because not everything is up for grabs. In fact, as Gout, who summarizes this work on the, especially philosophy of creativity, but she also looks at work beyond philosophy, says creativity, so there is a broad consensus, she says, that it involves the capacity to produce things that are original and valuable, right? So what's going on here? Well, whatever creativity may be, right? We may not know exactly what creativity is, but surely it must include some originality, and it must be that we find either the artifacts or the ideas that come out of a creative process as valuable. Indeed, this is also reflected in a recent article by two cognitive, Mark Rumko is a cognitive psychologist, and Garrett Yeager is an educational psychologist in a creativity research journal. So this is a specialist journal on creativity, where they say nearly every article in the CRJ at least briefly defines creativity. So here in the beginning, in fact, they're complaining a little bit that there's all these different definitions, but then they go on to say, in fact, the definition they're using, which is broadly broadly accepted and thus can be called the standard definition, actually has a long history. And then they go and say creativity requires both originality and effectiveness. Now, these guys are not naive. They know that this is not really a definition. They're just being a bit careless when they say a standard definition. They know that this just offers two necessary conditions for creativity. It's not a full-on necessary and sufficient conditions definition, whereby these two conditions are originality, just like what Gout reports, and effectiveness. What is effectiveness? Well, they understand effectiveness pretty much like especially if you understand both of these terms, both of these concepts in a broad way, then they seem to correspond, valuableness and effectiveness, because they give us examples of effectiveness, things that have some utility or some fit or some appropriateness, right? And if you understand value or valuableness in a broad way, perhaps you can fit those two perfectly, right? Now, of course, the devil is in the details. So just because there's agreement in this level of characterization, that doesn't mean that there's no disagreement at a more fine-grained level, right? But fair enough. At least we have, not everything is up for grabs. There are some people who disagree that, Benche Nane, for example, disagrees that originality is necessary for creativity. But on the whole, there is more widespread agreement on these two. Now, it's important when talking about creativity to also consider some of the things that Margaret Bowden, who is a cognitive scientist / philosopher, has said on creativity, in particular because she is one of the few people who have been sitting at this intersection of both research in creativity and also research in the philosophy of AI or issues concerning AI. And she has her own definition, which is in broad agreement with what I mentioned earlier with the originality and value requirements. So roughly speaking, her view is something like, creativity is the ability to freely generate ideas and artifacts that are novel, surprising, and valuable. Okay, so you see she splits in a sense novelty and surprisingness. So that's originality split into two. And then she also has a notion of valuableness. And then she also has a notion in there of freely generating, which is a kind of a notion of autonomy, which we come back to later. Crucially, she deems the question of whether AI can exhibit genuine creativity to be not fully answerable at present. She doesn't think that we can fully answer this question, even though it's a little bit confusing. She does give an answer to this. She just doesn't think it's the full answer. I'll explain this a bit later, but it is a definitive answer in a sense. Her reason for saying that, well, we can't really fully answer this question right now is that she thinks that there's often profound disagreement over the meaning of key concepts that are associated with creativity, concepts like intentionality, consciousness, value, emotion, and so on. Okay. Now, following Bowden, we are going to largely sidestep the issue of value in the next few slides. I'm very happy to talk about this if you guys want to bring it up in the in discussion, but I'm not considering, at least definitely not directly, perhaps indirectly, I'm going to consider some issues of values. But originality is an issue that is broached in my talk, but it's done so in a distributed manner as it's incorporated in some of the arguments that we're going to be considering. These are the arguments that people have against creativity in AI, that AI cannot be genuinely, deeply, meaningfully creative, right? And I'm going to consider in particular 3 arguments. One is the argument from autonomy, that's due to Margaret Bowden, among others. 2, an argument from psychopathology or madness, you might say. That goes back to Plato. And then 3, an argument from over-inclusivity, which we can credit Goud for it, even though she doesn't really endorse it. I'll come back to that later. Again, these are not the only arguments. There's lots more. It would be impossible to cover all of these, probably not even in a whole course. So I'm just going to focus on these 3. I'm going to say what they are, what these arguments are, and I'm going to come up with some counters and see if I can convince you. Okay, so let's start with some arguments against creativity in AI. Okay, so let's look at the argument from autonomy. Right? So just I'm trying to really summarize the essence of this argument in the first bullet point. Creativity requires autonomy, and machines can have it. Right? So in order to have genuine creativity, you need autonomy, and machines cannot have genuine autonomy. So here's a quotation. I always like to use quotations because that way I'm backing up my claims that somebody is attributable, so can be attributed this view. So this is from Bowden again, who says, the answer is clear in only one case, that of autonomy. So she's considering all these different notions associated with creativity. And she says, well, these notions are, there's deep disagreement over them. But when it comes to autonomy, it's pretty clear that it's pretty clear what the answer is. Namely, no programmed system can be truly autonomous. Computers cannot be truly creative. Program systems do not possess autonomy because the program, even if it's one that bears some resemblance to human freedom, was originated by a human being. If we take the argument about autonomy seriously, she says, then we can agree that AI creativity is a contradiction in terms. Right? It's even a contradiction in terms. That's almost meaningless. Now, this is not a full answer. Remember before she said, I told you guys that she insists that it's not the answer of whether there's creativity in AI is not, we cannot fully answer it. That's because we can't really address all these dimensions of creativity. But it is nonetheless a definitive one. Why? Because this is one of those dimensions, and she considers this to be effectively a necessary condition. She denies, in fact, that there are any necessary conditions for creativity, but she says more or less that this is effectively a necessary condition. Okay, so if it fails this one, and that's why she's making all these very strong claims, right? So if we take the argument about autonomy seriously, then we can agree that AI creativity is a contradiction in terms. Right? So, so it fails this condition of creativity, and therefore cannot be creative. Here's the other argument, the second argument. This is the argument from psychopathology. Again, I'm summarizing it in the first bullet point, which says creativity is fundamentally tied to psychopathology, so to all sorts of mental illnesses, and is thus irreducible to computation. So presumably here, what we mean is that computation is meant to be somehow rational, and therefore you could not reduce some kind of mad, irrational behavior to computation. And if creativity is fundamentally tied to it, then you wouldn't be able to explain the whole of creativity, right? So this goes back to Plato. So this is Plato in Phaedrus. So this is Plato's Phaedrus, rather, where he says, if any man come to the gates of poetry without the madness of the muses, persuaded that skill alone will make him a good poet, then shall he and his works of sanity with him be brought to naught by the poetry of madness, and behold, their place is nowhere to be found. So it's not going to be, they're not going to be recognized, I guess. So you need madness. You need what is basically some kind of divine inspiration the madness of the muses to produce some work that makes you a good creative poet. So that's, I mean, this might look a bit weird for those of you who know a bit about Plato, because Plato is known as having a very rationalistic approach to the world. And indeed, this kind of an approach he reserves only for poetry. When it comes to other things that we would call art today, what they called back then techne or crafts, he thinks that those are much more rational activities. Right? There are other people we can cite here who make similar remarks about madness being the stoking creativity and so on. Those include Friedrich Nietzsche, or also we have it's escaping me now. I might remember later. Okay, Schopenhauer, of course. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at the third objection. The third argument is the argument from over-inclusivity. The idea here is as follows. Breaking down distinctions and over-generalizing concepts, so being over-inclusive, in other words, makes creativity possible, and machines cannot do that. Right? That's the gist of the argument. And this argument owes a lot to the writing of Eysenck, who ties up creativity, links creativity to personality. And he says the following things. He says, some people are over-inclusive in their thinking, having a rather wide conception of relevance. I suggest that this cognitive style lies at the basis of creativity, providing the individual whose thought processes are over-inclusive with a larger sample of ideas for the search process, thus making possible the production of unusual, novel, and creative ideas, right? So being over-inclusive is really very much necessary for being novel, for producing unusual, novel, and creative ideas. I have to say a few things here about this work. First of all, Eysenck himself doesn't make the claim that over-inclusivity cannot be found in computers or AI. That we should get out of the way. Secondly, Eysenck is a bit of a controversial figure because he's been accused of concocting all sorts of studies in his work, right? So nonetheless, he's super highly cited, and he is cited in the literature on creativity, and people take this kind of an idea very seriously. And why shouldn't they? Even if the guy did indeed do some, let's just say, unpalatable things. This looks like it's a kind of a neat idea, I find it, right? So that somehow you need to break down some boundaries, break down some distinctions. You need to overgeneralize to be creative. That it's a part of at least it might be a necessary tool that you have in being creative. Okay. Now, Goud, I mentioned Goud as being the originator of this objection to creativity in AI. In fact, she doesn't really endorse this objection. She just suggests this as an objection to rationalizing the notion of creativity. And of course, rational accounts and mechanistic accounts of creativity go hand in hand together. So this is obviously something that we can also launch against against people who think that there is genuine creativity in AI. Okay. So those are the objections. So it would be, I guess, useful at this point to look at what my counters are to these objections. So let's take a closer look. Okay, so we begin with autonomy. Right? Now, it depends on what you understand by autonomy. So suppose now that let's take a couple of readings of autonomy that are not going to be so great to begin with, but at least we can get them out of the way, and then we settle on something that might be a bit better. Right? Now, take autonomy to mean the ability to exercise free will. Are humans autonomous in this sense? Well, we can say that it should be pretty clear that the human will is shaped by nature, and some people say so nature and nurture, right? That's how the human will is shaped. I don't like to use this notion of nurture in the sense that it's somehow separate from nature, because obviously nurture is part of nature. It's just a different part. So here I use nature 1 and nature 2. Right? So the human will is shaped by nature 1, namely evolution designs our genes or molds our genes over long periods of time. And then nature 2, that's nurture, affects our development and affects each individual, right? But machine will is also shaped by nature 1 and nature 2. It might be that there are different parts of nature that enter into this shaping process, into this molding process. Namely, it's not evolution that shapes machines, but it's humans that design these architectures, whether they are hardware architectures or they're algorithmic architectures. And then you also have nature 2, nurture, or the learning phase, let's say, in a machine learning algorithm, which affects the development of the model that is being built. But in both cases, we see that there are some hardwired elements, namely genes versus architectures. And then there's some soft-wired ones, which are the learned semi-flexible behaviors that emerge. So I don't see any difference in these two cases between humans and machines. So I don't think this is going to work for the naysayers, unless, of course, you are somebody who believes in dualism. I don't even want to touch dualist views, and you can't have some kind of supernatural story about how the human will is, infused by something like divine inspiration, and it's, there's a soul and so on. But I don't want to talk about fairy tales. Okay, let's try something weaker. Suppose autonomy, we mean by autonomy something like the ability to act independently from others and in unforeseeable ways. This connects to what John was saying earlier. I liked his conception of autonomy, which was something like transferring decision-making from one agent to another, and then that allows, of course, the other agent to act independently and so on, right? Even though I think John mentioned maybe he doesn't like this notion of independence, but there's a sense of separation between the agents and some kind of activity that is free from control, from continuous control. Okay, then I'm adding here also unforeseeable ways. That's also a problem for the naysayers. So the naysayers are not going to be able to motivate this as a good argument against creativity in AI. Why? Because it's pretty clear that this kind of autonomy does exist in systems already, right? And so this is also supported by what Boden says. I think she's absolutely right when she says this. She talks about genetic algorithms. These are algorithms that can also change. So they have the ability to change themselves bit by bit, right? And they can produce, they can work independently, so they don't need constant supervision, right? So they take decision making, they can do it themselves, on their own. And then they can even be unpredictable. So here's a little quotation from Boden. So computers' performance may be unpredictable and may even involve the development of values, preferences very different from those of the programmer, right? So absolutely. She mentions, in fact, 2 digital artists who use these kinds of algorithms. That's Carl Sims and William Latham, right? I thought about presenting you with a couple of some of their works here, but just look them up. So Carl Sims and William Latham, look them up online. Now, that's also not going to help then the naysayers. But what about this one, right? I say here a better conception. I shouldn't have said a better conception. I actually kind of like the autonomy conception we already talked about, so I agree with John. I just wanted to say that, since the objection is Boden's objection, that means we have to look at exactly what Boden means, right? So what does Boden mean when she says that machines are not going to have that kind of autonomy? What does she mean by autonomy? Well, let's go back to this quotation I gave you earlier, the longer quotation, and let's just take a little extract where she says, programmed systems do not possess autonomy because the program was originated by a human being. It's about tracing the some kind of ownership of the action back to the originator, right? So the program might have done some stuff, but it's only done that stuff because the program was designed that way by a human being. Okay. So I want to give you a little thought experiment here that defeats this kind of, in my view, it defeats this kind of problem, this kind of interpretation of autonomy and the argument that it supports. And it goes as follows, right? So bear with me. Right? Imagine now a collection of machines somewhere in the universe that produces new species, so biological species, on the basis of a complete science of biology, plus all sorts of random, and it's very important that you have all these random kind of elements in the process, right? So you have the random elements. That means that all sorts of different things may come out. But you also have complete understanding of biology, so you don't need to produce things that are not going to be viable. And suppose that at some point these machines, this collection of machines, produce a member of a new species. Let's call her Mada, right? And suppose, moreover, that they act as her parents and her instructors. Now, as an adult, suppose, Mada produces some extraordinarily creative works of art, science, and technology. Would we then say that Mada cannot be truly creative? Would we say that Mada cannot be truly creative? That's the question, right? And it's meant to elicit some kind of intuition here. I mean, you may, of course, say, yes, she's not truly creative, because you know where this is going, right? But if you do say yes, and you say, yes, she's not truly creative because she was designed and nurtured, that would be a question-begging answer. Why? Because that's the whole point at issue, whether being designed and nurtured is, in fact, a it's the question. So this is the thing that's being under debate, right? Whether being designed and nurtured means that you cannot have autonomy, right? So it would be question-begging if the answer was just yes, because she was designed and nurtured. You would have to give some independent reasons why design and nurture is prevents one from being autonomous, right? In these weaker senses, right? Now, why would anybody be tempted to say, yes, Mada is not truly creative? Well, they might be tempted because they can see already there's a structural, and that's why I created this thought experiment, because there's a structural analogy between Mada and machines, right? So Mada was designed and nurtured by machines, just like we are designed and, just like we design and nurture machines. Right? So if the answer is no, so Mada can in fact be truly creative, then we cannot also deny that machines' autonomy merely by virtue of the fact that they are created, right? So one would have to answer analogously here. Okay. Let's now look at the second objection, the psychopathology objection. So there are indeed some results in psychology that suggest a connection between mental illness and creativity. In fact, this study by Ludwig in 1992 is often cited in the literature on those who oppose, in particular, rationalized and mechanized accounts of creativity. So Ludwig looked at biographical information on over 1,000 people and concluded the following. The results indicated that individuals in the creative arts and professions experienced significantly more psychopathology and underwent psychotherapy more frequently than those in other professions, and that certain forms of psychopathology were predictive of creative achievement. So there's a positive correlation, in other words, between psychopathology and creative achievement or creative processes. Okay, now here's my counter. The Ludwig study has a number of issues. Chief amongst them is, in fact, the fact that the study samples only highly successful individuals. In fact, the study filters so it chose the individuals on the basis of biographies reviewed in the New York Times book reviews. And of course, that's problematic because you might say, for example, more highly successful people, if it isn't the case that more highly successful people are more likely to go and seek psychotherapy, and that's one of the measures used to determine psychopathology, then of course that we have a problem, right? But that's just my little quibble with the Ludwig study. There's more weight in what the following thing I'm going to say, namely that there was a recent systematic review of 121 research papers on creativity and psychopathology, which concluded the following. So they looked at all sorts of studies on the connection between psychopathology and creativity, and the authors concluded research in this area is hampered by methodological problems, especially the definition and assessment of creativity. This makes interpretation and comparison of studies difficult and possibly accounts for the contradictory results of this research. In other words, not only are there contradictory results in this research, but also there's no good agreement on how, not only how to define, but also how to measure creativity, and that creates a lot of problems. So we could not say that the evidence is conclusive in this respect. Here's a related point now with psychopathology. It seems this kind of bridges this objection, the psychopathology objection, with the over-inclusivity objection. This is a nice quotation from Linus Pauling, who once said, the best way to have good ideas is to have lots of ideas. Right? Here I have 4 paintings. These were made by my dad, who is unfortunately no longer with us. He was a very prolific guy. He was also, in fact, a paranoid schizophrenic. And the way he proceeded to do his works was by taking a theme and then creating tons and tons and tons of variations on that theme, first of all on a piece of paper and then on canvas, right? So this is a perfect manifestation of this idea of the best way to get to make to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas. Basically, you try out. It's basically trial and error, right? You do a lot of stuff, right? That, of course, doesn't reduce the whole of creativity, trial and error, but that is one of the important constituents, right? But similarly, in AI, there are search algorithms that try out numerous solutions. They do a kind of a similar thing. And moreover, you don't need to just take very brute, naive approaches to search problems, just trying out any random solution. You also have heuristic algorithms that help structure the search. And that's precisely what human beings do also. They don't just do completely random things, they structure their search. Okay, finally, I'm almost done. We have the over-inclusivity objection. So we can ask the question, are machines incapable of over-inclusivity? There seems to be no general proof that this is indeed the case, right? But to make some progress, and I can't really say for sure that they can do all the over-inclusivity stuff that the human beings can do, but to make some progress, I just want to look at some examples. In particular, I want to discuss one area where over-inclusivity may play a role, namely scientific discovery. I'm a philosopher of science, actually, so that's my bread and butter, to talk about science and scientific discovery. Now, many famous episodes of scientific discovery can indeed be understood in terms of over-inclusivity, at least as involving, not just being a matter of over-inclusivity, but as involving over-inclusivity in the sense of knocking down boundaries. So I have some examples here. For example, in the past, our conception of astronomy that goes back to Aristotle and the Ptolemaics had this idea of a heavenly sphere that was sitting, furthest away from us, and in fact at an infinite distance from us. But this sphere was perfect, so the stars on it, all the stars are sitting on this heavenly sphere, and the stars are never changing, they're perfect, and this sphere is immutable, it doesn't change. This, of course, was knocked down by Copernicus, who started thinking about the stars as having different distances to the Earth, and also Tycho Brahe, who of course discovered supernova and realized that the heavenly sphere, that the stars could not be immutable. It must be the case that there are some changes in the sky. There are other examples of this kind of knocking down of boundaries. So Kepler, for example, took him a while, but he gave up the idea of trying to solve the problem of planetary motion in terms of perfect circular orbits. This is a problem that goes back to at least Plato, who told his students that they should try and come up with systems of accounting for the motion of the wandering stars, what we call the planets nowadays, through perfect circular orbits, right? And the whole Ptolemaic system of astronomy is based on such an idea, but of course that has to be given up, and Kepler does so. Right? There's also other ones. I don't want to bore you with details. So the knocking down of the boundary between terrestrial and celestial physics, or between electric and magnetic phenomena. Now, are machines incapable of this kind of over-inclusivity? The evidence we do have, albeit partial, right, incomplete, let's say, suggests otherwise. There are all sorts of heuristic and other methods out there that are used in machine learning and in AI more broadly that can and are being used to produce successful results. So analogical reasoning, for example, so Evans in 1968 had this program called Analogy. I don't remember now. I think Analogy, and that was trying to play this kind of game you find in intelligence tests of just comparing shapes and coming up with analogous inferences. There's also a preference for simpler. So this Analogy is a nice case of over-inclusivity. Why? Because so analogy in science, for example, is very useful. So when Newton came up with his inverse square law for gravitational phenomena, that prompted a lot of other scientists to see if they can find out domains of phenomena that are subjected to the same kinds of laws of nature, so to say kind of structurally the same laws. And of course, in electrostatics, Coulomb discovered an inverse square law. So that was taking one solution that applies in one domain and trying to apply it in other domains and seeing if it works. And sometimes it does, and it's very useful to be able to do so. So machines can do that. Preference for simpler hypotheses, simpler, more unified hypotheses. There's a long literature on this stuff, on Bayesian information criterion, like K information criterion, regularization of models. This just suppresses the sensitivity to the data, so that we can avoid overfitting by choosing simpler hypotheses. And in a sense, it's a kind of an over-inclusivity. Right? And the same thing with feature extraction, where a machine is not given certain features, but it's asked to extract them, and can end up extracting very different features than what a human being would extract. Okay, so let me just skip to the last. This is the last slide before the summary. So I'm just going to discuss very briefly two discoveries made by machines. These are not, they're kind of modest discoveries. They're not really amazing discoveries. So Bacon 1, famously in the 1980s, it's an expert system, discovered Kepler's third law, which says that the basically the semi-major axis of a planet cubed divided by the orbital period of that planet squared is constant for any planet, right? And it discovered, Bacon 1 discovered this law on the basis of age app data. So they were given, so this program was given the data that Kepler had available. This was work done by so Herbert Simon and his group. Now there's an objection here as to how creative this this program was. So Gillies, for example, Donald Gillies says that the variables were given to Bacon 1, and also Bacon was coded to look for constancy relations as opposed to other kinds of relations between these variables. So we can't really say that it was creative. But my reply to this is pretty straightforward, and it's the following: that looking for such relations and variables is in fact a very shrewd evolutionary design. So evolution has designed us to be this way, to look for invariant relations, to look for laws of, that's what laws of nature are, right? And it also designs us to look for simple variables. The kinds of variables cited in Kepler's law are, in a sense, you consider them very simple, because semi-major axis is a kind of a distance variable, and then the orbital period is a kind of a time variable, right? It's a time variable, right? So if evolution equipped us with these kinds of tools, why shouldn't we pass on the favor to the machines, design them that way, and then let them loose on the world and see what they produce? More recently, a machine learning approach, not an expert system approach, at MIT discovered a new antibiotic by training a deep neural network on chemical data. This was, again, it's more modest than it sounds a little bit, because the halicin, this antibiotic, was in fact a chemical compound that was known. It was tried out for diabetes. It didn't work out for diabetes, but then the machine was let loose on these chemical libraries, on all of this data, and then it basically uncovered halicin as having the ability to fight bacterial infections. And in fact, halicin is very structurally very different from existing antibiotics, and is effective against various bacterial infections when it was tried out in mice trials. Okay, so that's it. Basically, none of the three arguments work. I'm sorry it took a bit longer than I wanted it to take, the talk. And for the fall, I'm just summarizing the reasons here. And then what can we conclude from this? Well, only that the case for the naysayers cannot be made on the basis of the aforementioned arguments, at least in the way that I tried to articulate them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Votsis. That was very interesting. Do you want to leave the PowerPoint up or take it down?
Whatever you guys want.
I think we can leave it up, and then we can flick through if we need to refer to it. So as you mentioned, we did go a little bit over time. So if you're okay with that, should we just move straight into questions? Yeah. Okay. So everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A. Since we are moving straight into questions, if somebody does have a question straight away, you can just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Or Mick already has a question in the Q&A, so I'll just enable him to talk. You're enabled now.
Thank you. The question is, it's kind of a question and a statement. I thought that was really interesting, Ioannis, but it seems to me that even the thought experiment depends very much on creativity, because there's a judgment being made by either some biological entity or machine that something is creative. And you can see algorithms literally creating new insights or executions. But I don't think we've yet got to a point where somebody would believe that they would be able to create the next Rothko or Picasso, is really my question. So I guess it's coming down on the side that's saying some kinds of creativity are possible, but other kinds of creativity are not. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Let me try and go back to the slide, the appropriate slide. That's the one. Yeah, very good. Okay, so I have to say that, again, I can't really, it's a very, these are very general claims, so you have to take it case by case, right? So I just haven't seen any example that for me is, says it's impossible for a machine to create something like that, right? So let me motivate this thought experiment a bit more, because I have variations of it with more details that might give you, you know, might make you less doubtful. Right? So, for example, I have a variation where there's also another being called Eve, who creates exactly the same works of art, science, and technology, maybe in another galaxy, in another universe, maybe in another, what we say in philosophy, in another possible world, something that's completely causally independent and, you know, closed from us, right? Now, if we were to say that Eve created something, that she was truly creative in that context, then I don't see why matter could not be said to create something. So this goes to the way I understood your comment, Mick, was that it's also about the judgment. So you're referring sort of to the socio-cultural maybe approach to creativity, that also the judgment of experts has a role to play here, and perhaps experts may not be so willing to give a judgment of creativity in such cases. So yeah, or am I misunderstanding you? Maybe.
No, I can you hear me still? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you are understanding, and I think I wasn't really critiquing what you're saying, because I think it's hugely valuable, and I agree with almost all of it. It's just that when you get to the definition of creativity itself, that seems to me to be, as you started out the presentation, the crux of the whole thing. How do we decide something is really creative? And even if you look at the art market, how do we decide something is a masterpiece? I mean, yeah. Rothko was starving until he was quite long in the tooth, kind of thing, and then committed suicide. Now the paintings sell for $80 million. So who decides that creativity is really the point I was trying to get at.
So my naive, maybe intuitive attitude to that is that if we're looking at de facto what's going on, then obviously there's all sorts of forces that decide the value of work of art and how creative it is. Some of them, I think, are objective things, and some of them are more subjective and more maybe a bit cynical as well. So so art dealers and so on have a say in this kind of stuff, and people with money and so on. But ultimately, to go back to your main point, one of your main points, it's that there's all sorts of kinds of creativity. I'm just saying I can't really think of any good example where there is no possible way for the machine to create that. I can't really see any impossibility argument for any subtype of creativity. That's what I'm saying.
I'd agree with that, Ernest. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think Gabby had a finger on this.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to comment that the poll that we did yesterday was actually Ioannis' question, and 74% of people responded that will machines ever be as creative as humans? And they said they will develop a different form of creativity, not really dismissing the possibility of creativity. And one of the attendees actually, he's not able to be here today, so I'm kind of like proxying, but he mentioned that we normally think of creativity as this internal process that is inherently human, very much like, I would say, the sublime and the idea, the Kantian idea of art and creativity. But creativity could also be seen as a product, is something that, despite of what processes can get you there could be qualities, like Ioannis was saying, in terms of what we can recognize as a creative product. And so in that sense, I just wanted to compliment that.
Thank you, Gabriela. So let me just very quickly comment on that and just say that thanks for carrying out that poll. It's a bit of a biased sample in the sense that we're all interested in AI and creativity here. So maybe also the answers were not given by me. So you guys chose the options. So actually they were pretty good, the options. And there's still I still find some resistance there by people when they say, so for example, in the way that the answer is formulated, yes, but it's going to be a different kind of creativity, right? Because for sure, there will be some machines that have a different kind of creativity, just like different humans have different creativity, right? If you fine-grain it enough. But the question is whether they can also have that ability to create as humans, right? And I don't find anything, I'm somebody who is very much in favor of demystifying things. And I don't think that there will be any boundary that cannot be overcome in reproducing human cognition. In my view, human cognition, at any rate, even broadly understood, is some kind of computation itself. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. Yeah. Other questions?
Thank you. We'll go to Dennis first, and then, unless Vincent, you have a finger on this, then we'll go to you after that. Okay, Dennis.
It's a hand. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I very much agree with what you've been saying, and it's a brilliant presentation. And I was wondering, with the notion about creativity, so in that sense, I was maybe thinking more about if we already use AI as a tool to amplify creativity, I wonder how does this influence our understanding about creativity and AI, and the difference between maybe, and it's related a little bit, I think, to what was said previously, is it maybe the difference between creativity on the one hand and originality, and the notion then of inspiration. So for instance, are we original in that respect, and has a lot of things that have inspired us to, for instance, put pen to paper or to paint already been influenced, for instance, by our external factors, and therefore would AI just not kind of reflect that back towards us?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm having a little bit of difficulty engaging with this because you mentioned a few things, and maybe it's scattering my brain in all sorts of weird configurations. So in terms of creativity, so assisting us in creativity machines, yeah, we're already doing that, and it's nobody's probably going to deny the usefulness of that. But at the end, perhaps maybe that's a nice step towards understanding again that our place in the universe is as some 2-bit players. But what's the expression? Right, we're small players, and that eventually. So in the beginning, maybe we're completely resistant to creativity in AI. No, absolutely not. No, they can't even help us do anything interesting. Now we move towards the idea that, oh yeah, they can help us being more creative and so on. Perhaps in the future we might even move to the phase where we're going to be helping machines be creative a little bit, and then at some point just let them be creative, because really we can't really expect to sit at the apex of meaningful creativeness and deep creativeness for very long. I mean, we are, after all, in a very, we're living in a kind of a village of the universe. We don't have any real competitors here. Monkeys or maybe dolphins or ravens. So that's the comment I want to engage with. Perhaps you want to come back and emphasize something else, Dennis, or?
No, I think that kind of answers the question. It was more, I think I should have been clear, but it was in that sense my mind was going everywhere as well about, can we use this kind of development actually to be more relativist and show that it teaches us more about us, that this technology actually teaches us more about our own creativity. But yeah, I think you've answered that viewpoint.
Yes. So we'll go to Vincent next.
Okay. Hi, Yanni. Thanks for that.
Hi, Vincent.
Interesting talk, and nice to see you here, at least online. I was sort of distracted from a lot of the talk by a remark that you made right in the beginning, which got me thinking a little bit about the idea of super intelligence and sort of super creativity. And I've been trying to figure out what that might look like. It relates to what I talked about yesterday, namely the idea that intelligence is some kind of maximizing expected utility, maybe whether that is a way to look at it anyway, right? So if that is a way to look at it, that would explain what you would call, I think, the quality of the solution, right? You had something like originality and quality. So it's useful for this purpose that we're looking at. I wonder whether creativity, so to speak, dissolves in the extreme case. That is, imagine that you're having a relatively narrow space in some case. So for example, chess, right? You can say that somebody's a creative chess player, or that was a creative move. I think that's kind of something that we do say. But if you know enough about the chess position and the possible moves that you could make and so on, at some point it seems that you could search, well, maybe not all the space, but a really large part of that space. And if you're super intelligent. So is there perhaps a sort of limit at which the notion of creativity dissolves altogether? Because that's not creative anymore, right? If I have a, let's say I have an end game that I can actually compute all the way down, right? It's not too demanding. Can I then find a creative solution, or is that a creative solution?
Fantastic question. So I take creativity, I guess, like lots of other people in this area, to be somehow relativized to whatever else is available at the time, right? So in that respect, if everything, suppose we have a theory of everything, and suppose we have all sorts of, it's more difficult to imagine it outside of science, actually, but let's just stick to the sciences example, it's simpler. Then maybe there's no more creativity in science, right? Suppose also we come up with all the, the most efficient methods of collecting data and so on, right? So there's no more creativity then in science. Creativity then is just relativized to what was available at the time. So it's very useful here to cite Borden again, who has this P side. So P creativity and H creativity. So P creativity is psychological creativity. It's when it arises in an individual who hasn't thought of that before, right? Whereas H creativity is historical creativity, but they're both relativized to some kind of point in time, right? As to super creativity, it would still be relativized. You wouldn't have it unless so it would not be complete creativity, because once you reach to complete creativity, then it collapses back down. I think I agree with you, to no creativity, right? But as to super creativity, I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about proofs in mathematics and how machines use proofs, construct proofs, and how they use heuristics, right? So in a sense, a heuristic is a kind of it's a very creative thing. Why? Because it allows you to see things. So what mathematicians say, it's the human intuition that you see that this theorem can be proved somehow, and then maybe it takes you like 100 years to prove it. Machines have something similar in the sense of the heuristics they use to cut out a lot of the steps and go use a shortcut to get to that point, right? So you can imagine a super creative machine that is nearly perfect. They can almost see all the relevant interesting consequences of a bunch of axioms, and that makes them super creative, right? But they just fall short, because if they didn't, then maybe that might be might collapse to no creativity, right? So it's gone. Everything has been created already, right? In that sense. Yeah, I hope that addresses some of the things you brought up, Vincent.
Yeah, thanks. It does. I think it's interesting how you could sort of imagine that, because we say these things like that was creative for a child. It would not count as creative for you, let's say, but for a small child, you'd say that is a really creative solution. And if you take this relativity further down, then it does look like at the end it will collapse in the super intelligence case.
Well, one distinction though here, some people might have a problem with connecting super intelligence with super creativity. They might be willing to accept super intelligence without accepting super creativity, simply because creativity somehow is more than intelligence. I'm not one of them, but yeah.
Okay, we're running out of time a little bit, so let's try and move on to the next couple of questions. This one's been sitting at the top for a while, so it's an anonymous one. I'll just read it out. What is the difference between autonomy and independence in AI and free will in humans?
Whoa. So I guess very, very big question. I guess I tried to explain this a little bit when I was going through all these different interpretations of autonomy. So I said, well, if you accept autonomy, if you think autonomy is something like free will in the strongest sense of the word, then that just means something that cannot be determined. So your actions cannot be determined by physical, let's say the physical realm. So somehow you have some kind of input that evades the physical realm. So this is the conflict between free will and determinism. Of course, there are compatibilists who try and answer this kind of question. It would take too long to get into that kind of debate. So let me leave that to one side. A more reasonable approach is what John was saying, right? So it's basically the transference of the decision making. So long as an agent can go out on its own and do its own things and make decisions on its own, then you have that kind of autonomy. But there's also this issue of that I mentioned earlier of Boden, who understands autonomy as a kind of it's not freedom from determinism or anything like that. It's about the origin, the source of let's say the creativity. And she thinks that, oh, it's the human beings who program the computer, therefore the source of the creativity is the human being, not the computer. I hope it, to some extent, it addresses some of these issues.
Thank you. We are running out of time. I would say to you, Ioannis, that you can still look at these questions and we'll move them into the answered sections, but you can still look and give a reply if you want to. The last question that we'll take is from John because he can't put in a question. So you can go ahead with that.
So thanks, Zach. An illustration and then a question. So the guys that I know in Rolls-Royce have used machine learning algorithms to design parts of aircraft engines. And I think one of the significant things is they've said these algorithms have come up with designs that no human designer would have come up with. And you might argue that's because of the way that they're trained. So I wonder, for Ioannis, if one criterion you ought to have in looking at this in some sense is cognitive diversity. If it does something different to what others would have done, then is that not an important dimension of creativity?
Sure. This was incorporated in, let's go back, where was that? In this, I guess, concept of unforeseeableness, right? So unforeseeable, so if others haven't thought of it, if it's somehow cognitively deviant in some respect, then you might say that's a kind of understanding of, at least in this sense, it's autonomy, but you can also, if autonomy is part of, it's a necessary condition for creativity, you can understand it as being a component of creativity, right? It is something that also Boden takes into consideration with these genetic algorithms which change themselves until at some point they can produce, and I'm quoting here from this slide, the development of values or preferences that are different from those of the programmer, and perhaps, in the case that you're mentioning, very different from any other one, any other human being, right? So, yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ioannis, for that talk. It was very interesting. We do have just 3 minutes until the next talk. We might be a couple of minutes late starting, seeing what happens. But the next talk is Professor Hogg. And let's take a quick break, have a cup of tea, and come back then.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. We are getting ready to have our final speaker of today and to close our workshop. Professor David Hogg. He's Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Leeds and Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. He's also Director of the UKRA Centre for Doctoral Training in AI for Medical Diagnosis and Care. Today, he will be talking to us about AI and common sense. Welcome.
Thanks, Gabby. Okay, let me just share my screen and get going. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Yeah, it's working fine.
Great. Right, well, I'm going to touch on common sense and AI. And what I want to finish with is really with some speculations about what might be possible. But the first part of the talk is really just leading up to that final slide that sets out some of the things that I've been thinking about over the last 3 months. So my assumption is that today's AI systems really have very little common sense. And although there are people working on common sense and there are some areas in which progress is being made, I think it's fair to say that most systems out there have nothing really approaching common sense. And by common sense, just taking the definition here, the ability to think about things in a practical way and make sensible decisions. One of the consequences of this is that in areas like health, where I work quite a bit, there's a real move to, and has been for some time, to have AI systems that can explain their reasoning. And to have a black box that simply comes out with a decision is really not enough. The clinician, the patient, need to feel confidence in the decision. So they want to know something about how that decision has been formulated. And then really it's the clinician in the loop, and more generally the human in the loop, that actually provides the sense check. So if something has gone horribly wrong because something completely unexpected has arisen, then the clinician will recognize that. And so it's the clinician that's providing the common sense. So you might look at that in this way, where you have a task, some kind of AI task, which has been narrowly prescribed. And the AI task makes its decision, which might be a medical diagnosis. But the real requirement is a much bigger problem. And it's the clinician that's looking after the real requirement, which is to make that diagnosis, interpret it, and then decide where to go with it, to convey it to the patient, etc., etc. So the common sense is really being done there by the person that's using the AI system. And just to illustrate, I thought I'd just give one illustration of this. The well publicized in the last 2 years, 3 years, this work from DeepMind that appeared in Nature Medicine. And it's a system that maps from digital OCT scans of the retina, and it maps through to a clinical diagnosis. So it can give you a number of possible things that could be wrong with the patient, or indeed that the patient's eye is perfectly normal, the retina is perfectly normal. And one of the decisions they took in designing the system was to go via a tissue segmentation map, which means that it's something that's in complete registration with the original digital OCT scan, but it's color-coded to show you what the anatomical, give an anatomical label to each pixel in the original image. So you get these rather nice pictures like this. And that's something which a clinician would be very familiar with. So a clinician could look at that picture, and not only does that then give them confidence that the computer has made a sensible mapping from here to here, because they can also look at the image in looking at this back at the original image, just to make sure this looks makes some sense. But it also, looking at this, might actually help them to appreciate why the particular decision has been made. So by putting this intermediate step into the system, it provides some transparency. It's not an English language explanation, but it provides some transparency in the decision that's been taken. Such a step, it's not something that we necessarily require of clinicians. If a clinician comes up with a diagnosis, they make a note of it, but they're not going to be constantly asked to justify their decision normally. But we require computer systems to do it because we don't really believe that they will exercise any kind of common sense, and we're not absolutely certain that what they're doing is the right thing to do. So, in principle, how could we go about imbuing an AI system with common sense, something like that? Is that just something that we're never going to have, or is it something that we might think about how we could go about doing it? And what I want to do is in the next part of the talk is just to look at why that might be a hard thing to do. So the way in which we, or a clinician, or anybody doing a task that requires common sense, the way in which we learn about the world and learn to do these things is very different from the way in which a computer system currently learns to do things. We live in this unbelievably complex ecosystem, and we move around in environments like this one on the right, and we can make sense of everything that's going on around us as people are doing stuff. We can home in on things and know what's going on. And we're constantly learning about new things that people do, new environments, what this particular place looks like. So we're constantly learning as we live in this world, and sometimes we're also in a more formal setting where we're actually being shown things by a parent or a teacher, somebody else. So there are many ways in which we learn about the rich environment in which we live, and that's the playground in which we learn to exercise things like common sense. We're also different from computers in one very other important sense. We can sense, we not only have our external senses, but we also have internal senses that sense our internal workings. So the hypothalamus regulates all our key processes, and we're aware of most of these processes. So we are aware of the impacts of changes in this regulatory process, in the way that we sleep, in our heart rate, how hungry we are, etc., etc. Now, a computer system is never going to have that. Maybe there are ways of having some sort of surrogate. I don't know how you would do that, but a computer system is never going to have that. And so that's a fundamental difference in the way in which, if one's looking again at the clinician, Eric Topol's book on deep medicine talks a lot about empathy. Now, empathy is not common sense, but you could never, if you really want to empathize with a patient, if you don't have the same sense of inner workings that we have, how could you ever build something artificial that could substitute for that? It's an open question. But again, even with common sense, if you don't experience these same things, how could you learn to operate common sense, which assumes that when a person exercises common sense, it assumes that they have access to these same sensory stimuli as the person or as the environment in which you're working. Now, today's AI systems and the way in which they learn from a completely different, on a completely different basis. Some of it's shared. They can watch TV. They can download movies from Netflix and watch the movies. So, we spend a lot of our time doing the same thing, and we learn from it. And computer systems, much of the research in computer vision, for example, or in natural language understanding, will work from similar sources of data. There's the Internet of Things. We don't really learn from that so much, but you're in principle, a lot of devices that are on the internet, such as weather monitoring stations or similar things, provide another source of data that computer systems could in principle learn from. We can put computer systems in simple play environments like these Google robots here that are simply put on top of a box which has lots and lots of objects in it, and they just play around inside the box and eventually learn through positive feedback to pick the things up and in principle manipulate them. But in this case, it's a sort of bin picking exercise. So these play environments can be used to learn how to do stuff. Quite popular are video and board games, putting computer systems into video games specifically, and getting them to try and reach some objective within the game, and they learn by trial and error within the game. Or board games, famously the AlphaGo board game, where actually it doesn't involve sensing the environment at all. What it involves is playing games against yourself until eventually you learn to be a really good person, a really good player. Linking back to John's talk earlier on today on autonomous vehicles, computer systems can also learn from demonstrations. And so learning to drive a car, if you put the computer system such that it's able to look outside the vehicle and at the same time sense the driving commands that a human driver gives, then it can learn to relate the sensory input from outside the vehicle to the driving commands that the steering and braking things that the driver is actually doing. It can learn to make that relationship. And then the other obvious thing one might say about the way AI systems learn is that if you're in robotics, the bodies that you're working with are much less capable. So the things that you can do are much less capable than humans have available to them. I miss one thing, which is related to media from the internet, and that's social networking. And an awful lot of research is looking at tweets and the like to try and learn stuff from social networking systems. So the environment's completely different. I'm just going to take a little aside here just to make one other obvious difference, which is that our bodies have actually evolved in parallel with the ecosystem. So we're not, if you think of the human being as being a long line of things that have existed on the planet over millions of years, then the way in which we do things is actually, obviously very tailored to the sophistication of our bodies at the time. And so that capability has actually evolved through time. And I made no excuse. I showed this at a workshop, philosophy workshop a couple of years ago, and I apologize to people that were at that and may have seen this before, but I'm just going to show one video which just gives a very different way of learning about how to behave in the world. And this is from 1994, a remarkable piece of work from Carl Sims, who was working at MIT. And this evolves creatures that do things. And it's evolving not just the ability to move around in the environment, but it's also actually developing the morphology of the creature. So the fact that it's made of half a dozen blocks and they're connected together in this way, and there's a very simple neural control system that operates to control the angles, or if you like, little muscles that operate between these joints. And then it simply has to do a very simple task, and it evolves to maximize its performance at that task. In this case, it's moving across the ground as rapidly as possible, and the creature is evolved to move quickly across the ground. Interestingly, one of the shapes that did this very well was to simply build a big tower and then let it fall over, because the center of mass then moves very rapidly across the ground. But that's not something that perhaps we would think about doing. And then the other one, which will come up in a minute, which I won't wait for, is swimming towards a light source. So it develops a swimmer towards a light source. And all of this, done an awfully long time ago, is done by an evolutionary mechanism. And I think, again, in one of the earlier talks, talking about having a whole new biology, you can imagine a whole virtual world containing these things, gradually increasing in sophistication to exhibit really interesting behaviors. And that would be entirely in simulation. And what a great exploratory environment that would be if one had such a thing available. Right. So I want to now turn to sequence modeling, and partly because it's been an area of great, I think, a lot of interest and excitement over the last 5 years in AI. And the idea is that if you have something happening in the real world that can be represented as a sequence of tokens of some kind, then the task is quite simple. It's to build a probability distribution, or distributions like this. So you could have this joint distribution between what's the probability of a particular sequence occurring, where that sequence can be of any length. What's the probability of this thing being emitted from our system at the end of this long chain of tokens? So if you've observed this chain, what's the probability you're going to observe this? So it's an extremely general framework. Now, this framework has been tackled by recurrent neural networks and variants on recurrent neural networks for several years with some success. Recently, there's a new model come along called the transformer, which really has kind of taken things to the next level. There's been some well-publicized work recently on language modeling, where the tokens are words or characters, or more likely short chunks of characters, which occur very frequently. So you come up with a sort of an optimal set of tokens that can be used to represent strings of words, paragraphs of words, in a very succinct way. So it's been widely used in language modeling. It's a vibrant area at the moment. And generally what happens is you train it on very large data sets of text. And in the most recent work, these systems are being trained on a very substantial proportion of the text available on the web. Most famously last summer, the so-called GPT-3 system from OpenAI was trained on pretty much everything that could be accessed on the web. They did filter out stuff that was obviously gibberish, but it's got pretty much every document that could be scraped from the web inside the training set for this system. And the system has an order of magnitude more parameters than any of the systems that went before. It's got 175 billion parameters in this neural network, which, as I said, is one of these so-called transformer networks. And the thing that characterizes transformer networks, one of the problems with these things here is that if you want to know the probability of this here, a recurrent network would be pretty much dominated by the things that came most recently. Wasn't very good at being influenced by the stuff that happened a long time ago. Some things like so-called LSTM networks got around some of that, but the transformer has basically got around it by flattening it. And so you no longer treat this any differently than you no longer treat Sn-1 any differently than you treat S1. And so there's the potential for any of the preceding things to actually influence what the next utterance is. And that's important in language, where what you say next needs to be influenced by what may have happened many, many words earlier in a sentence or in a paragraph. Okay, so this has been a very exciting area, and GPT-3 can do a lot of different things. The most recent work is showing all the things you can do using the trained system. So here's an example. This is generating news articles. This is a problem that's been tackled for a long time, but the system can generate has a fairly remarkable performance. What you do is you prime it with this text in black as the sort of, if you like, the inputs to the system, and it then generates text like this. So this is one example. They actually got human raters to rate the examples, and this was the worst. This was the worst one of 80 examples, I think. No, 80 human. Yeah, can't remember the way around, but this was pretty much the worst one. But it's pretty good. The raters had to judge whether it was a human uttering it or the computer, and the performance was not bad on that particular test. So we can do things like that, but GPT-3 is also being used for some common sense reasoning. And this is the kind of thing that it can do. They tried it on lots of different common sense tasks. And so this so-called physical QA data set that has questions like this. So, the goal is to make an outdoor pillow, and you have to decide between this one and this one. Blow into a tin can and tie with a rubber band, or blow into a trash bag and tie with a rubber band. Correct answer being the second one, and you basically have to give the correct answer. So by framing the problem in a suitable way and putting it into GPT-3, they get the response. With zero shot, meaning that you don't change the weights inside the neural network that generates the sequence probabilities, they get 81% accuracy. So this is straight off the ground. Now, I don't think anybody would claim that this is demonstrating common sense. You know, there is a focus on sort of physical and scientific reasoning, and it's quite narrowly defined in the different experiments. So I wouldn't really say that that was common sense reasoning. And it's also, you know, one of the things one might say about all of this is that it's only about language. And actually, if you want to operate common sense, you've got to have all the senses available. You know, vision is also very important, and the auditory, all the other information in the auditory waveform the spoken utterances, because you get all of the intonation and everything. So there's much more to things than just the language. Well, you know, again, recent work, and just came out in January, and I think this actually relates to the discussion we've been having on creativity earlier. This is actually from a system called DALI, which is also from OpenAI. This is not published yet, so I haven't been able to read the paper. So all you have is this website that popped up on the 5th of January. And what they've done is they've trained this sequence modeler to take in not sequences of tokens, in other words, sentences, but sequences that contain words like this caption here, or this statement, an armchair in the shape of an avocado. So it takes in things like that, and also takes in a string that is a rasterization of images. So if you have images which are of, say, a car, then what it does is it actually encodes that image as a 32 by 32 image, where each location in the 32 by 32 is a kind of encoding of everything that's in that chunk of the image. So you've got 1,024 numbers encoding the image. And they take that 1,024 numbers in sequence from top left to bottom right and put it in the context window of the network. So you have the text, that's 256 tokens, followed by 1,024 tokens that characterize the images. And then you let the network do its business, and you train it on a large data set. So this is not the whole of the internet, this is just a very specialized data set. And then what you do is you stick into the system a caption in English. And what comes out are pictures. It generates pictures by simply continuing the sequence into the bit of the sequence which is describing an image, the 32 by 32 image, which is then is an encoding of the image. So that then gets decompressed and generates a full resolution image. So this is the kind of thing. The system had only been shown armchairs and had been shown avocados. But if you say an armchair in the shape of an avocado, you get this kind of thing out. Now, I stress that nobody has seen the paper yet, or at least I haven't seen the paper yet. I don't think it's yet appeared. And so this is all based on simply a website. So it's, based on this, the people that produce GPT-3, and I guess that this is really a system that can do quite a bit. So what I wanted to do really, and just in the last few minutes, I just wanted to speculate about what this might mean for common sense generally, and perhaps providing a different kind of way of thinking about machine learning. So this is my final slide, and this is the hypothesis that I've been thinking about for a few months now. Supposing you had GPT-3 and its probabilistic representation of pretty much everything that's been said on the internet in textual form. That representation is a hugely rich representation of the world. Of course, it doesn't have any visual information in it at all, but it is a very detailed and precise description of all of that text. And if you think of, inspired by things like this language of the language of thought hypothesis, which proposes that thinking in humans occurs in a mental language, which is a bit like spoken language. Just putting all that together, is it possible that one could take this language model and use it not to directly give you common sense, but actually to train a system which would have common sense? So you take a situation where you're sitting in the environment here, wondering what's going to happen in this particular situation. You've never encountered it before. And you take in the sensory data, you turn it into text, you test it against the language model, and you make a prediction, and then you can actually turn that into some kind of action back in the world. Now, that would be a sort of one way of using it, but it's not so much that way which I'm thinking of. What I'm thinking of is, would it be possible to take the language model itself, which contains this hugely rich description of the sum total of the writings on the internet, and use that as a way of testing hypotheses about the link between sensory data and action over here, in order to train a direct mapping over here. So you're using this as a something which, if you can map stuff into it, see what happens, make the predictions, test out the probabilities of things, whether it would be possible to then use that to train a something that would be operating with common sense in an environment like this. So you would throw this bit of it away when the system was actually being run and was being executed. But this is only necessary when you're actually training the system over here. So it's going back to the slide earlier on computers having access to this very different kind of experience of the world than we have access to. The richness of this representation is so vast that maybe there's enough structure in there to be able to drive learning in a range of different environments, which ultimately would not need the language model. That's the hypothesis. I've got no further than that. That's just it's just an idea, but I thought I would share that idea today. And I think it starts to sort of unpack what might be possible with common sense in the future. So I thought it was interesting in relation to this this workshop. So thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Well, everyone, you already know the drill. We'll give you some minutes to go into the Q&A section, and then we're going to start with questions. Panelists, if any of you have comments or questions, just raise your hand and I'll add you to the queue. So we'll be back in around 3 minutes.
Okay. I'll take the slides down, Gabby, shall I? And,
yeah, that's fine. Okay, we have our first question. Zoe Porter, I'm gonna allow you to speak right now so you can ask it yourself if that's okay.
Yeah, so, okay, so a question from Zoe. the first one.
Yeah, Zoe?
Yeah, I can read it out. Would you like me to? Okay.
Yes, please.
So I'm just going to read what I wrote. So, as everyone knows, a lot of the writings on the internet are false, extreme, inflammatory, discriminatory. They're not curated. So would they need to be to ensure that they did in fact reflect common sense?
Yeah, that's a good point. The GPT-3 paper actually has quite a long section on this and the problem of this kind of content on the internet. And how they've approached it, but more generally, I think the way in which, because the system is learning from the entirety of it, if that information dominated, then I think you've got a real problem. If that information is relatively rare, then it may be possible to detect it and eliminate it, get rid of it. But I think this is certainly an important issue, and so much so that it was interesting that the GPT-3 paper actually is the first time that I've seen, to quite that extent, a paper address what is a very important problem quite so extensively in the source paper on the technical contribution. But it's clearly difficult. But I think there are ways of approaching it, and people are actively working on finding better ways of approaching it. So that's what I would say at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next up we have Robert Tripp. I'm going to allow you to talk if you would like to say your question, please.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. The last slide where you have your feedback loop using the language model.
Yeah.
I literally this morning been reading Antonio Damasio, and he was talking about the human brain having kind of two models for generating, associating feelings with images. One is a direct one, somatic markers directly producing decisions and actions, and another one producing images and feelings for reason to then work on. It just struck me that you were talking about throwing away the language model. It would seem to me that you're kind of using it to create something like somatic markers in your direct link. Why would you want to throw away the language model as well? Wouldn't that be your next level up for reason after that?
That's a good point, Robert. I think it was a bit rhetorical. I wanted to emphasize the point. I think throwing it away would be rash. I mean, you would probably want to augment the model with all of the media that's available, image media and other stuff, and combine it with the language that's associated with that to create a richer model, a sort of GPT-3 plus, first of all. But no, it would obviously, that does contain important information, and there's no reason why you couldn't use that live in such a system. But I wanted to emphasize the idea that representation of the world, it provides a kind of canonical representation of the world, and that can be mined to help you build another system. So it was just for emphasis, but in general, perhaps you wouldn't want to do that. So it was a good point.
Great, thank you, Robert. Ioannis, would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure. Thank you, David, for that talk, which I found very interesting. Let me see if I understood you correctly. So you were comparing RNNs and transformer networks, and the way I understood the two is that the RNNs are not very good at being influenced by things that happened earlier. They process data in an order, right? So the more recent stuff weighs more heavily, I guess. Whereas the transformer networks take everything into account, so they process data in a kind of it doesn't have to be ordered. And in a sense, it seems to me you can summarize what transformer networks do as they don't discount the past, right? So they take all these data into consideration. So now it seems to me intuitively, because I don't know the technicalities of them, that such networks are probably good with something that's things that are slowly evolving, like a natural language, for example. So when they're taking all this text, they're taking text, of course, that was written in various different times, but natural language does evolve, but not as fast as some other physical systems. So I wonder how such a model would work on more rapidly evolving and more stochastically evolving systems. Say a contagious virus mutating.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that could be represented as in terms of sequential data, but I mean, I can imagine a way that it could be represented as sequential data. And then I wonder if transformer networks are not going to help us there, then perhaps what would?
Well, I think I mean, two things to say. One is that the task that you're setting, the GPT-3 transformer network has 2000. I think it's a 2048 context window, and all of the symbols have to fit into that 2048 window, and then it basically compares everything with everything, uses an attention mechanism, and so it's able to take that whole thing en bloc and give you a probability distribution about part of that, a part of that window that's open. But if your population is evolving the whole time, then you probably want to have an online learning situation where you actually change the weights inside your network in order to evolve with your data set. So if you want to keep your, if the language is evolving slowly, if the language is evolving rapidly, suppose you're in a situation where the language is evolving rapidly and you want to continue to model that accurately, then probably what you'd want to do is be constantly retraining online. So you're constantly grabbing more data and adjusting the weights in your network so that it keeps pace with the. So I think it's not a limitation of the limitation is not with the size of the window. The limitation would be that the whole thing is evolving, so you've got to retrain. I hope that helps. It's the knowledge about the distant past would be contained in the weights of the network. So the fact that there was a prime minister of a certain name in the 19th century would be a fact that was contained in the wider network. Your 2048 context window would be much more to do with today and now. How do I incorporate that into some kind of query? If I have a question about it, then you pose the question in this window that goes into the transformer, but it's the weights of the transformer that encode all the knowledge from the past. So if that helps.
I kind of understand what you're saying, if I can follow up. But so I guess what you're saying is that there's some flexibility even within transformer networks to account for these kinds of more rapidly evolving systems.
Well, you have to train it, yeah.
And you have to keep training it.
Yeah, you would just keep training it.
I guess the reason why I brought this up is because you presented transformer networks as avoiding one problem, namely they don't discount the past. Yeah. But in some cases, you do need to discount the past because things are so rapidly evolving that you need to be more in the present. That's the point, right? So.
Yes, I see. I think the 2048 window really limits you to the very recent past. Typically I think there's a sort of a juxtaposition here of the past as it's actually represented in the network, in the weights of the network, and the past as it's represented in this sequence of which we're trying to find certain conditional probabilities. So it's a different sort of timescale, really.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next question. Dennis, Doctor, I'm going to allow you to talk now.
Thank you. Hi, David, and nice to see you, and thank you for your nice presentation. I was wondering, and you kind of already highlighted it, how do you think the weighing of decisions can be applied and should be further investigated within the decision-making progress in terms of understanding language, both, I think, written down and expressed in other ways? And do you think that this kind of the development thereof would be more dependent on time and data feed and other factors related to technological development? So how do you do you see that developing AI to understand common sense more as a time issue or as something else?
Well, certainly, maybe as I understand it, you're thinking about AI in the clinical decision-making process. What happens at the moment is, what might happen with an OCT example is that from the DeepMind system, is that it would give the diagnosis to the clinician, who would then decide what actually happens. And so the decision that the system is taking is really very low level. It's basically which disease is this likely to be, and it gives a probability distribution across possible diseases. Of course, what the clinician is confronted with is a much bigger decision. They have a much bigger decision-making process about what treatments, looking at the other medical background on a patient. And you could continually extend the reach, I guess, of the inner system, of the AI system, to try and give advice on these different things. So, for example, another thing you might do is actually input to the system not just the OCT scan, but some of the medical history of the patient, or an OCT scan from 3 years ago, so that you have a temporal sequence. Particularly in whole body scanning, if you were to do whole body scanning on a regular basis, you could well end up with lots and lots of false alarms, because you see things in the whole body scan, and you really don't know whether that's a problem or not. But if you look at 5 years ago, you see that the same thing was sitting there looking exactly the same, then you know that there isn't a problem. So widening the problem, I think, is always going to be an important thing to do. And at the moment, the systems tend to be very narrowly defined. It's the clinician that brings the wider picture. Dennis, I don't know whether that really explained thing, but I think that's hopefully that helped.
No, it does. It's indeed. I was thinking about, as we develop more means of measuring our behavior, whether it's by looking actually what happens internally or externally in terms of actually looking at our movements. Yeah, and I think that it's more a computational issue in the future than more of a, that we're more limited by that than actual being able to do it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm going to read an anonymous question. It says, if AI's common sense approach relates to how AI's assumptions correspond to only achieving goals in the external environment, does this mean AI's job is to analyze the world and not to question it?
Yeah, I think the problem here is that we tend to pose AI problems which are rather simple problems. So we ask it to classify what's in an image, or we ask it to tell us what's going to happen when I turn this glass of water upside down, in a kind of naive physics environment, and the water's all going to come out. So we pose these somewhat constrained problems, and that's all we know. It's the kind of getting the AI to question things in the world obviously is on a much higher plane of understanding than simply knowing what happens when you turn a glass upside down. I think that's one of the huge constraints at the moment of current day AI, is that it's just solving very simplistic tasks, and not the sort of task, or not the kind of thing that we do every day, where we do question things around us. And so it's I don't think people know how to build these wider systems that can actually behave a little bit more. It relates to autonomy. It's that autonomy thing. They're not really autonomous. They're being told an autonomous driving thing is not so much autonomous in a general sense. It's been put in a situation where it has to drive, and that's all it can do. It's not being asked to think about the world as it drives, and whether that street sign really should be there or shouldn't be there, and whether they should widen the street, or whatever it might be. So I think. Yeah, it's a constraint of current AI. Part of the research in AI, I think, is broadening that boundary. I think it's having creative thinkers that can think about how to push these boundaries out, so that you're not only thinking about the classification of images. I think. Sorry, one final thing. I think one of the very promising things over the last few years has been people trying to do that by looking at, say, images and text together, rather than just defining simple image classification problems, or text classification problems, is sentiment analysis, for example, but actually looking at multimodal systems where you combine these different things together and get it to do more interesting things, and constantly pushing out the boundaries of interestingness into the sort of autonomy territory and stuff, I think is key problem.
Great, thank you. And our last question is from Mick Yates. I'm going to allow you to talk if you want to elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, is that okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly fine.
Go ahead, Mick. Hi.
Hi, David. Good to see you.
Yeah, and you.
It's really, I really like that last model. And I've always thought that common sense and judgment are kind of very strongly related concepts. And it would seem to me, based on the model, that actually what you're saying is it might not be possible today, but given enough data sets on enough different and disparate issues, then eventually this problem of common sense in machines could be solved. It might take a while. It might take a lot of supercomputers and so on, quantum computers, but it is solvable with the right data sets. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, yes, I certainly believe it. I believe it is. I don't, I regard myself as, essentially machine-like. And I don't mean that in any kind of detrimental sense. If you think about machines as being assemblies of molecules behaving in various ways, and that you have this emergent intelligence in it, I don't think really I'm any different from something that one day we might be able to create. Yes, I do think that eventually it will be possible to do these things. But by the time that comes, we will think about ourselves in a very different way as well. And I don't think we'll think of ourselves as being, this limited in some way, and suddenly there are these super beings being created outside us. And of course, we have to be wary of that. But it's my own view is that we will evolve as rapidly as anything else that happens, and so it'll seem like a natural process by the time it happens.
So that would suggest, putting words into your mouth, the singularity is actually a non-event. It's more like a continual process.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, yes. You could. Yes. Singularity need not be a threat in that way, because in fact we are carried along with the singularity ourselves. Would be the or we're always one step ahead of the singularity, or putting it in something like that way. I mean, there are active people thinking about we extend. If I pick up my mobile phone, it's a remarkable resource. I can go on the internet. I mean, throughout this workshop, I've been sort of Googling terms that I wasn't familiar with, or we're all doing this all the time, using it as an extension of our brains. Well, what's the way things are going, that kind of relationship with your phone might actually become a bit more intimate, and people might feel completely comfortable with that. And this is just a remarkable thing. It enables me to be so much smarter, and I just have much more enjoyment out of my everyday life through having this rather more intimate relationship with the information that sits behind my mobile phone. So imagine that, then just sort of extrapolate that forwards, and you're feeling completely comfortable with it, and the singularity sort of never happens in that sense.
I think that's a great point, David. Thank you.
I think we are done with the Q&A section. We do have a comment from Chris McGowan, the director of our Applied Ethics Center. Chris, I don't know if you want to say a few words.
I didn't really, thanks Gabby, but I was just writing to David to flag how far I'd got processing the talk, but I will take the opportunity. I mean, so just to say what I said in the question, the only thing I said was that I was left wondering about the account of common sense that David gave at the beginning, and I wasn't sure. And it's not something I thought about. I don't think I've actually asked myself what I mean when I refer to common sense. But my reaction was to wonder whether David's initial account at the beginning was what I understood by it. But can I just take the opportunity to thank you, Gabby, and Zach very much for organising this workshop. I think it's been a really fascinating couple of days, obviously incredibly diverse set of talks, and also really good questions from the audience. I don't know how large the audience is. I see there's 205 people have been viewing yesterday's proceedings on YouTube, so that's great. And no doubt similar numbers and probably increasing numbers today. But I think it's been fantastic. It's obviously a lot of work for you guys setting it up. It's great that it's brought in people from across the world to something that we've organised in Leeds. There are people like Emma in Johannesburg, which is Emma's just a name to me, but it's a name I recognise, and I'm aware there are other people in other countries who've been online as well. And I'd also, as the director of the centre, like to thank all the speakers very much as well, who you brought together. I think it's been a really great set of talks and lots of things for us all to go away and think about. But above all, as I say, thanks to you, Gabby and Zach, for putting this together. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I would also like to join on the thanks to all the speakers. I know these are difficult times, and it's very challenging to get together and have conversations and have insightful, engaging discussions, and we were hoping for that. I thought it was a great way of achieving this, and we hope to have future events in which we can all participate as well. Also, thank you for everyone joining in YouTube. We've had a lot of viewers. We're really happy about that. We hope you enjoy this, and overall, thanks for participating, and thank you obviously to Zach for helping me out in organizing this. So I would like to just say thank you, and we're now going to stop this workshop. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and thank you all for joining. We have all our speakers there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabby.
Thanks, Gabby. Thank you. Thanks, Zach.